I drove up the winding gravel road, my tires crunching over loose stones as the sun sank lower in the sky. The cabin was tucked deep into the woods, far from any town or highway, just the way I liked it. A friend had let me use it for the week, a chance to get away from everything. No phone service, no distractions, just me, the trees, and the quiet. The cabin was a small, sturdy structure with weathered wooden walls and a slanted metal roof. There was a front porch with an old rocking chair and a bundle of split firewood stacked against the wall. I parked my truck beside it, grabbed my duffel bag, and unlocked the door with the key my friend had left hidden under a loose floorboard on the porch. Inside, it was simple, just one main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and a cot tucked into the corner. There was a door that led to a cramped bathroom with an old clawfoot tub and a toilet that flushed with a rattling sound from the water tank outside. The air smelled like dry wood and dust, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of the floorboards under my boots. I set my bag down and opened the windows to let in the cool evening air. The forest outside was dense, thick with pines and undergrowth, stretching for miles in every direction. I could barely make out the old logging road that had led me here through the trees. It was perfect, just what I needed. That first night was peaceful. I made a simple meal on the old gas stove, read by lantern light, and eventually climbed onto the cot, pulling the rough wool blanket over me. The night was silent, the kind of silence that you only get deep in the woods, where there are no cars, no hum of electricity, nothing but the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I fell asleep easily. The next morning, I woke up early and went outside. The air was crisp, the forest damp with dew. I walked around the cabin, checking out the area. There was an old shed a few yards away, its wooden walls covered in moss. The padlock on it was rusted shut, and the hinges looked like they hadn't been touched in years. I didn't bother trying to open it. The day passed quietly. I hiked a little, gathered some firewood, and spent the afternoon by the small creek that ran a few hundred yards from the cabin. It felt good to be disconnected from everything, no emails, no calls, no obligations. Just me and the woods. That night, as I was sitting on the porch, I heard something. It was subtle at first, just the sound of leaves shifting, twigs snapping. I figured it was a deer or some other animal moving through the trees. But then it stopped. Just silence. I waited, listening. Nothing. The woods had gone completely still. I shook it off and went inside, locking the door behind me. I wasn't worried. This was deep wilderness, and animals moved around all the time. I lit the lantern and sat by the stove, letting the heat warm the small space. Eventually, I crawled into bed, exhausted from the day's hike. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something had changed. The air felt different. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not a deer or a raccoon. These were deliberate, slow, careful. Someone was outside. I stayed completely still, my heart hammering. The footsteps moved around the cabin, circling. Gravel shifted near the truck. I wanted to grab my flashlight, but I was afraid even the smallest movement would make a sound. The footsteps stopped just outside the window. I felt it before I saw it, that creeping sense of being watched. My breath was shallow, barely there. Then, slowly, the lantern light caught the faintest shadow shifting against the thin curtain. Someone was standing there, right outside. I didn't move. My gun was in my bag across the room, too far to reach without making noise. I listened, heart pounding. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away, slowly, steadily, fading into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn. Gripping the knife I kept on my belt, listening for any sound. When the first light crept through the trees, I finally got up and checked around the cabin. There were footprints in the dirt, circling the building. They weren't animal tracks. They were boots, heavy ones. I had no neighbors. No hikers should have been out here. No one should have been here at all. I checked my truck, my gear. Nothing was missing. Whoever it was, they hadn't broken in, hadn't stolen anything. They had just watched. I considered leaving right then, but something in me resisted. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was just exhaustion clouding my judgment. but I decided to stay. The day passed without incident. I kept my knife on me at all times. I carried my gun when I went to the creek. I didn't wander far. I checked the shed again, but it was still locked, rusted shut. The footprints had dried out in the morning sun, becoming less distinct. By afternoon, I had almost convinced myself it had been nothing. That night, I locked the door, kept my gun close, and slept in my clothes. And then, sometime after midnight, I woke up again. The footsteps were back. This time, they didn't circle the cabin. They came straight to the door. I held my breath, gripping the gun tight, staring at the wooden planks of the ceiling. The door creaked slightly as weight pressed against it. Then, a slow, deliberate knock. Not frantic, not hurried, just a steady, patient tap. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then silence. Minutes stretched on. Nothing. And then, I heard the footsteps again. But they weren't leaving. They were going around the cabin towards the shed. The rusted lock on the shed door had been untouched for years. But that night, I heard it snap. I stayed awake, gun in hand, staring at the door until the first light of morning. And then, without hesitating, I grabbed my bag, threw it in the truck, and left. I never went back, never asked my friend about the shed, never wanted to know what was inside. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear that knock. I had been looking forward to the cabin trip for months. The idea of getting away from everything, no reception, no noise, no distractions. Just me, the woods, and time to myself. The place I found was deep in the mountains, miles from any real town. A little one-room cabin with a wood stove, a creek nearby for water, and just enough amenities to get by. The rental listing had emphasized its isolation, saying it was perfect for those who wanted to disconnect from the world. That was exactly what I needed. The drive up took longer than expected. The last stretch was a rough, unpaved Forest Service road, rutted out from years of neglect. I had to take it slow, my tires slipping on loose gravel, my suspension groaning over deep potholes. Trees grew thick on both sides, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out most of the late afternoon sun. It was beautiful in a way, but also eerily quiet. No other cars, no signs of people, just the sound of my tires crunching over dirt and the occasional bird call. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun had already dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin itself was small, old but sturdy, built from thick logs that had weathered decades of harsh mountain seasons. There was a single window next to the door and a covered porch with a rickety wooden chair. Behind it, the dense forest stretched for miles in every direction. The nearest neighbor was supposedly 10 miles away. I killed the engine, the sudden silence almost overwhelming. I sat there for a moment, letting the stillness settle over me. Then I grabbed my bag, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The air smelled of old wood and dust, but it wasn't unpleasant. The interior was simple. One bed against the far wall, a small wood stove in the corner, a table with a single chair, and shelves stocked with dry goods. There was no electricity, no running water, just a propane lantern and a pile of firewood stacked beside the stove. I spent the first hour unpacking, getting everything in order. I filled the lantern, set up my sleeping bag, and went outside to gather some kindling before it got too dark. The woods were silent, save for the distant sound of the creek. I felt a strange sense of unease, but I chalked it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place. By the time I got a fire going, the sky had turned deep blue. I made myself a quick meal, then sat on the porch, staring out into the trees. It was peaceful. No cars, no city noise, just the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But as I sat there, a strange feeling crept over me. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a sense that I wasn't entirely alone. The trees seemed darker than they should have, their trunks stretching endlessly into the void. I shook the thought off. I was just getting in my own head. I turned in early, the exhaustion from the drive catching up to me. I locked the door, secured the windows, and climbed into my sleeping bag. The cabin was warm from the fire, the flickering glow casting shifting shadows across the walls. I listened to the quiet for a while, then closed my eyes. I don't know what woke me. One moment I was asleep, the next I was staring at the ceiling, heart pounding. It was completely silent. Not just quiet, the kind of silence that feels unnatural. I strained my ears, listening. Then, just barely, I heard it. A soft crunch of footsteps outside. My stomach tightened. Could have been an animal, but something about the sound felt deliberate. Slow, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. I held my breath, waiting. The footsteps moved around the side of the cabin, stopping just beneath the window. I stared at the dark rectangle of glass, half expecting to see a face staring back. But there was nothing, just the sound of my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, slow, retreating into the trees. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I stayed like that for hours, waiting, listening, but the footsteps didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I must have drifted off. Morning came too fast. The first thing I did was check outside. There were tracks in the dirt. Not animal tracks, boot prints. They circled the cabin once, then disappeared into the woods. I tried to tell myself it was a hiker, someone who got lost and stumbled across my cabin. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. No one should have been out there. I spent the day on edge. Every sound in the woods made my skin crawl. By afternoon, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my things, loaded up the truck, and got the hell out of there. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I got back to town, I told the owner what happened. He just looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Yeah," he said, "that happens sometimes." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know, and I never went back. I rented the cabin on a whim. I'd been working too much, feeling stretched thin, and something about the idea of getting away, even for just a few days, sounded right. The listing showed a small, one-room log cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The pictures made it look cozy, wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, a sturdy little front porch overlooking a clearing, the kind of place where you could sit with a cup of coffee and listen to nothing but the wind in the trees. It was cheap too, suspiciously so, but I didn't ask questions. I booked it for 5 nights. I got there late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the trees. The drive-in had been long, the last stretch over a narrow dirt road that wound through the forest, barely wide enough for my car. The trees pressed in from both sides, thick and unbroken, and I realized how truly alone I was. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. No signs of life beyond the occasional deer darting between the trunks. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected, but looked just like the pictures. A single room, a bed in one corner, a small kitchenette, a rickety wooden table with 2 chairs. There was a fireplace, though no firewood. The place smelled like old pine and dust, like it hadn't been used much. There was a front porch with a single rocking chair, overlooking a stretch of clearing before the forest swallowed the land again. I unloaded my things, stocked the kitchenette with the food I'd brought, and set up my sleeping bag on the bed. There were no neighbors, no cell service, no Wi-Fi. It was exactly what I wanted, total isolation. That first night, I sat on the porch as the sky darkened, drinking a beer and listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful at first, but as the night deepened, the quiet became oppressive. The trees seemed to absorb sound, muting everything. It made me feel like I was waiting for something, though I couldn't say what. I went inside, locked the door, and got ready for bed. The cabin didn't have electricity, just an old lantern that cast flickering shadows on the walls. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The woods outside creaked and rustled, the normal sounds of a living forest. But then something else, a snap, a deliberate-sounding footstep on dry leaves. I held my breath, listening. Another step, slow, careful. My first thought was an animal, a deer, maybe a bear. But then another step and another, steady. Not the skittering movement of a 4-legged animal. Someone was out there. I sat up, heart pounding. The window over the bed faced the clearing, but I couldn't see anything past the darkness pressing against the glass. I told myself I was imagining things, that I'd been alone too long already and my mind was playing tricks on me. But I kept listening. Nothing. After a while, I must have fallen asleep, but I woke up several times in the night, convinced I'd heard something just outside the cabin walls. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. Nothing looked disturbed. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. The ground was damp from the night's dew, and it should have shown tracks, but there was nothing. I tried to brush off the night before, telling myself it had been the woods settling, the sounds of nature, but I felt uneasy. That day, I hiked a few miles into the woods. I found a stream, caught sight of a few deer. It was beautiful, untouched, the kind of place that made you feel like the last person on earth. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Several times I stopped, listening. The trees stretched in all directions, dense and still. But every now and then, I thought I heard movement, just at the edge of hearing, never close enough to see. That night, I built a fire outside. It gave me something to focus on, made me feel less alone. The flickering light pushed back the darkness, at least for a little while. But as I sat there, I had the distinct sensation of being watched. Not in a vague, paranoid way, I felt it, a weight on the back of my neck. I turned suddenly, expecting to see something just beyond the treeline. Nothing. I told myself I was being stupid. Just the isolation getting to me. I was in the middle of nowhere. There was no one out here. I forced myself to stay by the fire a little longer, to prove to myself I wasn't scared. But eventually, the feeling became too much, and I went inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I woke to the sound of movement again. But this time, it was closer. Someone was on the porch. The boards creaked under shifting weight. Slow, purposeful. A single step, then a pause. Then another. I stayed completely still in bed, barely breathing. The door was locked, but the walls were thin, and the windows had no curtains. If I moved, if I made a sound, whoever was out there would know I was awake. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. Then, the faintest sound, fingertips dragging over wood. Slow, deliberate. My heart was hammering. I gripped the flashlight beside me, the only thing resembling a weapon I had. I thought about shouting, but I was paralyzed. If I acknowledged whoever was out there, what would they do? Then the doorknob rattled. Not hard, not like someone trying to break in. Just testing it. I held my breath so long my chest burned. Then silence. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting. Eventually, the first light of dawn filtered through the window. I didn't sleep again. When I finally worked up the courage to check outside, there were no footprints, no signs of anything. But the dust on the porch had been disturbed, just slightly, like someone had been standing there, watching. I packed my things. I wasn't staying another night. I barely slept, waiting for the first real light before I got in my car and drove. Faster than I should have, down that narrow dirt road. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, until I saw other cars, proof that I wasn't alone in the world. I never found out who or what had been outside that cabin. I didn't want to. I just know that I was not alone out there, and someone was watching me. I should have known better than to rent a cabin that far out in the woods. It had seemed like a good idea at the time. 3 days off work, no distractions, and nothing but the quiet sounds of nature to keep me company. That was the plan, at least. I wanted to be alone, to clear my head, to get away from the endless noise of the city. The listing for the cabin had been straightforward. Rustic and secluded. No Wi-Fi, minimal cell service, but plenty of hiking trails nearby. It was perfect. I booked it without a second thought, packed a bag with some basic supplies, and made the drive deep into the mountains. It was a 3-hour drive from my apartment to the last town before the cabin, where I stocked up on food, firewood, and a few extra supplies. From there, the road got worse. The last 40 minutes were spent on a dirt road full of potholes, twisting through the dense trees with no signs of civilization. The deeper I went, the more I questioned if I had made the right decision. The road was barely maintained, The trees crowded in from both sides, and I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. Still, I kept going, following the directions the owner had sent me. When I finally reached the cabin, it was smaller than I expected. Just a single room with a lofted bed, a fireplace, and a tiny kitchen with an old gas stove. No electricity, no plumbing, just a water pump outside and an outhouse a short walk away. The place looked sturdy enough, though, and the surrounding forest was beautiful. It was exactly what I had wanted, at least that's what I told myself. I spent the first few hours settling in. I brought my cooler inside, set up my sleeping bag in the loft, and chopped some wood for the fire. The sun was already getting low, casting long shadows through the trees. I made myself a simple dinner, sat by the fire, and let the quiet settle around me. The only sounds were the crackling flames and the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. But as the night wore on, the silence became oppressive. I hadn't noticed it at first, but there were no animal sounds. No crickets, no birds, not even the occasional snap of a twig from a wandering deer. Just stillness. I told myself it was normal, that maybe the wildlife here was just more cautious, but it gnawed at me. Around midnight, I climbed into the loft and tried to sleep. The fire had died down, leaving only a faint orange glow in the hearth. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet. That was when I heard it, something moving outside. It was faint at first, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves, just beyond the walls of the cabin. Not the random scurry of a squirrel or the heavy steps of a deer, but something else. Something that moved with purpose. My breath caught in my throat, and I strained to listen. Then it stopped. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just my imagination or a small animal wandering too close. But I didn't sleep well after that. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to return. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. The next morning, I stepped outside, half expecting to find tracks in the dirt, but the ground was undisturbed. Maybe I really had imagined it. I shook it off and decided to go for a hike, hoping fresh air and exercise would clear my head. The trails near the cabin were narrow and overgrown, clearly not well traveled. I hiked for a few miles, taking in the scenery, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. It wasn't just last night's noises. Something about the forest felt off. The trees seemed too close, the air too still. Felt like I was being watched. I turned back earlier than I had planned. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the treetops, and that same suffocating silence had returned. I tried to ignore it, went about making dinner, and forced myself to act normal. But as darkness fell, the uneasy feeling grew worse. That night, the sound returned. This time, it was closer. I was lying in the loft when I heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. Not an animal. I knew that much. The steps were too heavy, too measured. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then, just like the night before, the sound stopped. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I don't know. I lay frozen, waiting, listening, but nothing else came. Eventually, exhaustion won again, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I was certain I would find tracks outside, but there was nothing. Not a single footprint in the dirt around the cabin. No broken branches. No sign that anyone or anything had been there, but I knew what I had heard. I debated leaving, packing up and driving back to town. But I had paid for 3 nights, and I didn't want to admit that I was scared. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. So I stayed. That was a mistake. The 3rd night was worse, much worse. I barely slept. I kept the fire going as long as I could, but eventually, the logs burned down to embers, and the cabin was swallowed by darkness. That was when I heard the sound again. Footsteps, closer than before. Slow, deliberate, then something new. The soft sound of something brushing against the cabin walls. A faint scrape like fingertips dragging across the wood. I gripped the blanket tight, my body frozen. The sound moved along the wall, circling the cabin. I knew without a doubt that someone was out there. And then, a knock, not loud, just a single, gentle tap on the cabin door. I stopped breathing, my body locked in place, every nerve screaming at me to run, to do something. But I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I didn't answer, I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, praying it would go away. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated. Slow, measured, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my things, threw them into my car, and left. I didn't care that I was leaving a day early. I didn't care that I had wasted money. I just wanted to get out of there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin sat there, small and still, surrounded by trees. I told myself I was overreacting, that there had to be a logical explanation. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The cabin door, the one I had locked before going to bed, was wide open. I booked the cabin on a last-minute impulse, thinking a weekend away in the mountains would do me good. It was early October, and the weather was supposed to be crisp but dry, perfect for hiking, reading by the fire, and just getting away from the noise of everyday life. The listing described it as remote but accessible, tucked in a small clearing near a creek, miles away from the nearest town. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive up started off easy, long stretches of highway giving way to winding mountain roads. As the pavement turned to gravel, my GPS lost service. I had downloaded the directions beforehand, though, and followed them carefully. The deeper I drove into the woods, the fewer signs of people I saw. No gas stations, no other cabins. Just thick trees on either side of the road, the occasional rusted-out trailer or long-abandoned hunting stand. I kept driving. By the time I found the turnoff, the sun had started dipping behind the mountains. The road narrowed into a single-lane dirt path with deep ruts and loose rocks. My SUV handled it well enough, but I had to slow down to a crawl in some places. The forest was dense, casting long shadows that made everything look darker than it should have been at that hour. Finally, after nearly half a mile of rough terrain, the cabin came into view. It was exactly as the pictures showed. Small, old but sturdy, with a covered porch and a stack of firewood beside the door. The clearing around it was just big enough for me to park and turn around if I needed to. Beyond that, nothing but trees. It was completely silent except for the soft gurgle of the nearby creek and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. No traffic noise, no hum of electricity, just nature. I let out a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension from the drive. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The cabin was simple. One big open room with a bed, a small kitchen area, a wood stove, and a single bathroom. The air inside was stuffy, so I opened a window before setting my things down. The old wooden floor creaked under my weight, and I noticed a few mouse droppings in the corner near the cabinets. Not unexpected in a place like this. I made a mental note to keep my food sealed up tight. I spent the first hour settling in. I stacked some firewood inside, double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, and started heating up a can of soup on the stove. As I ate, I looked out the window, watching the trees sway slightly in the breeze. The sun had set completely now, leaving only the pale glow of the moon filtering through the branches. It was peaceful, isolated but peaceful. The first strange thing happened as I was getting ready for bed. I had just finished brushing my teeth when I heard a noise outside, a dull thud, like something heavy landing on the porch. My first thought was an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a deer wandering too close. I turned off the bathroom light and moved quietly toward the window. The porch was empty. The firewood pile was untouched. The trees beyond stood still. I waited, holding my breath, listening for anything else. Nothing. After a minute, I shook my head and told myself I was being jumpy. First night alone in a new place, it was natural to be on edge. I locked the door, shut the curtains, and crawled into bed. Sleep didn't come easy. The cabin creaked and settled, the sounds unfamiliar in a way that kept me alert. I kept hearing things, soft rustling, distant snapping branches, but each time I got up to check, there was nothing there. Around 3 in the morning, I finally drifted off, exhaustion overriding my nerves. I woke up at dawn to an unsettling sight. The firewood stack on the porch was knocked over. The logs were scattered, some even rolling off the edge of the porch into the dirt. I stood there, staring at it, trying to make sense of it. Wind? An animal? But the logs weren't just tipped over. They were spread out, like they'd been deliberately kicked or tossed. I stepped outside, shivering slightly in the morning chill. The ground was damp with dew, but there were no obvious footprints. No claw marks, just the disturbed firewood and an eerie sense that something had been there, watching. I spent the day trying to shake it off. I went for a hike, following a narrow trail that wound through the trees. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, bright patches of sun filtering through the leaves, the sound of birds and distant water filling the air. I forced myself to relax, to enjoy the solitude. Still, I kept looking over my shoulder. More than once, I thought I heard something behind me, soft, deliberate steps that stopped whenever I did. I told myself it was paranoia, maybe a deer moving through the brush, but I didn't linger long. By mid-afternoon, I was back at the cabin, my stomach tight with unease. That night, it got worse. I locked up early, making sure every window was shut tight. I built a fire, trying to make the cabin feel warmer, safer. As I sat there, reading by firelight, I heard it again. That thud, the same one from the night before. This time, it was followed by something else. A slow, dragging sound against the porch floor. I turned off my lantern and moved to the window, my pulse hammering in my ears. The porch was empty, but my gut told me something was out there. I stood frozen for what felt like forever, barely breathing. Then, just as I started to think I'd imagined it, something knocked against the door. Not a heavy, demanding knock, just a slow, deliberate tap. Once, twice, then silence. I backed away, my hands shaking. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing. An animal, the wind, anything but what it really felt like. Someone testing the door. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, staring at the door, heart pounding at every little creak. The tapping didn't return, but the feeling never left. The suffocating sense that I wasn't alone, that something was waiting just beyond the glow of the firelight. The first light, I packed my things. I didn't care if I had another night booked. I wasn't staying. As I loaded up my car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Clear, human footprints in the damp earth. They led from the trees to the porch and then back into the woods. No shoes, just bare feet. Large, deep impressions that disappeared into the undergrowth. I didn't stop to think. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove away, not daring to look in the rearview mirror until I was miles away. I never reported it. What would I even say? No crime had been committed. There was no proof of anything. Just the sick, lingering certainty that I had never been alone out there. And whoever it was, they had been watching me the whole time. I don't go camping much. I never really did, but my friend Mark always pushed me to do things outside my comfort zone. He called it forcing a little life into me. I didn't mind that, and to be honest, I appreciated it sometimes. So when he convinced me to go camping deep in the woods about 2 hours from town, I agreed. I borrowed a tent, packed what I thought I'd need, and followed him in my car. The drive was quiet at first. Nothing but open road and occasional trees. As we got deeper into the area, the roads became thinner, winding through thick trees and hills that blocked out most of the sky. I could already tell we were far from any houses or stores. Mark had picked a spot that wasn't part of a campground. No other people, no marked trails, just raw wilderness. I remember thinking that if something went wrong out here, we'd be on our own. That thought sat in the back of my mind, but I shook it off. We parked our cars near a dirt path, grabbed our stuff, and hiked for about an hour before setting up camp near a clearing. The trees stretched high above us, their branches swaying slightly with the wind. The air smelled like damp wood and pine needles. Mark did most of the work setting up. He was used to this. I helped where I could, but I was mostly watching, trying to learn. By the time the tents were up, the sun was setting. We built a fire and sat around it, eating and drinking. The only sounds were the occasional snap of a twig in the distance and the wind pushing through the trees. I remember staring into the flames, lost in thought, when something shifted in the woods behind us. It wasn't a small sound. It was weighty, like something big moving through the brush. Mark heard it too. I could tell by the way he stopped eating and listened. Then silence. I waited, my stomach twisting, but nothing else happened. Probably a deer, Mark muttered, going back to his food. I nodded, but I wasn't sure. I'd heard deer before. This didn't sound like that, but I let it go. The night stretched on, the fire crackling, our conversation slowing. Eventually, we both got tired and headed into our tents. Lying in my sleeping bag, I listened to the forest. Distant rustling, leaves brushing against each other, the occasional chirp of an insect. Normal things. I don't know when I fell asleep, but something woke me up. A sound. At first, I thought I imagined it. Then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves and twigs outside my tent. I froze. It wasn't Mark. His tent was a few feet away, and I could hear his steady breathing. This sound was closer, right outside. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps were soft, almost cautious, circling my tent. I felt my heartbeat in my ears. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there waiting. Minutes passed. Then another sound. This one was worse. A soft, slow exhale, right next to my tent. I felt my stomach drop. My hands clenched the sleeping bag. I wanted to move, to check, to do anything, but I couldn't. Then nothing. Minutes dragged by, and eventually, the exhaustion caught up to me. I don't know when, but I must have drifted off again. Morning came, and the moment I opened my eyes, I remembered everything. I got up, stepped outside, and looked around. The ground was disturbed. Footprints, big ones, circled my tent. I stared at them, my skin crawling. These weren't from an animal. The shape was wrong, too human. I looked over at Mark's tent. He was still asleep. I walked around, checking the area, but nothing else seemed out of place. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was Mark messing with me. Maybe my imagination made it worse than it was. But the feeling stuck with me. The day passed without anything strange. We hiked, cooked, and sat around the fire again. Then night came. I wanted to leave. I told Mark I wasn't feeling great, but he convinced me to stay. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me tense up. Every gust of wind felt like something moving outside. And then it happened again. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, closer, then breathing, right outside. Couldn't take it. I unzipped the tent as fast as I could, grabbing my flashlight and shining it outside. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and the cold night air. I stood there, heart pounding, scanning the woods. The fire had died down, leaving everything dim. Then movement, not near me, near Mark's tent. A shadow, tall and thin, moving just beyond the firelight. I felt frozen. Then it stepped forward. For the first time, I saw it clearly. A man. But something was wrong. He was dirty, his clothes torn and stained. His face was pale, almost lifeless, and he was staring right at me. I didn't think. I ran to Mark's tent, shaking him awake. He groggily sat up, but when he saw my face, he knew something was wrong. By the time he got out, the man was gone, but the footprints were there, deep pressed into the dirt. We didn't stay. We packed our things as fast as we could and left, hiking back to our cars in the dark. Every few minutes, I looked back, half expecting to see him following us. We made it to the cars, jumped in, and drove. Neither of us spoke until we hit the main road. I haven't been camping since, and I never will. I don't know why I thought camping alone was a good idea. Maybe I just needed to clear my head, get away from everything for a while. Life had been too noisy lately, too much going on. I needed the silence, the kind that you only get deep in the woods, away from people, away from everything. So, I packed up my gear, drove for hours until I reached a place far enough from civilization that I could finally breathe, and started hiking in. The forest was dense, the kind where you could lose yourself if you weren't careful. My pack was heavier than I expected, but I kept moving. I followed the trail for a while before veering off, looking for a more secluded spot. I didn't want to be near anyone else. That was the whole point. I kept walking until I found a clearing by a small stream, perfect for setting up camp. I could hear nothing but the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of something small moving through the underbrush. Felt peaceful. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and ate the sandwich I had packed for my first meal. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The woods around me darkened quickly. I knew I should feel uneasy being out here alone, but I didn't. Not yet. The air was cool, crisp. I sat by the fire for a while, listening to the night sounds, the chirping of insects, the distant hoot of an owl. I let myself relax. At some point, I decided to turn in. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped myself in. The ground beneath my sleeping bag was firm but not uncomfortable. I lay there for a while, staring at the fabric of my tent, listening. The woods never truly go silent. There is always something moving, some noise in the background. I drifted off to sleep with that thought in my head. A noise woke me up. I don't know what time it was, but it was still dark. It wasn't a loud noise, but it was close. A soft crunch of leaves, like footsteps. I held my breath, listening. My heart pounded in my chest. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer wandering past my campsite. But then I heard it again. Closer this time, deliberate. Not the random movement of an animal, but something else. Someone else. I didn't move. I lay still, my body tense, waiting. The footsteps circled my tent, slow, careful. I strained my ears, trying to hear anything else. Breathing? A voice? Nothing. Just the sound of someone moving just outside my thin layer of protection. Then silence. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, listening. The footsteps didn't come back. Maybe whoever it was had left. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had woken up, half dreaming, and my mind had played tricks on me. I wanted to believe that. I forced myself to close my eyes, slow my breathing, pretend it hadn't happened. Morning came and everything felt different, less threatening. The sunlight filtering through the trees made my fears from the night before seem ridiculous. But still, I checked around my campsite. There were footprints, not mine. They were fresh, circling my tent. My stomach dropped. Someone had been there, watching me. I packed up my things quickly. I had planned to stay another night, but that didn't seem like a good idea anymore. I needed to get out of there. I started back toward the trail, moving fast, my heart still pounding. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow felt like someone watching. I just needed to reach my car, get out of there. The hike back felt longer than it had coming in. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But I saw nothing, just trees, endless trees. My breath was heavy, my legs aching from walking so fast. Then I saw it. Something that made me stop cold. A backpack, not mine. Old, dirty, lying just off the path like someone had dropped it there and never come back for it. I hesitated, my skin crawling. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I stepped closer, nudging it with my foot. The zipper was open, the contents spilled out. Clothes, a flashlight, a knife, a map, crumpled, stained, a wallet. I picked up the wallet, my fingers shaking. The ID inside was faded. The face staring up at me belonged to a man. I didn't recognize him, but something about the wallet, the way the leather had been worn, the way the corners had curled, told me it had been out here for a long time. Abandoned. I dropped it and stepped back, my chest tight. Whoever had owned this pack had been out here. Maybe they had never left. Maybe they had been watching me last night. I turned and started walking again, faster this time, almost running. I needed to get to my car. I needed to leave. When I finally reached the parking area, my car was still there, exactly how I had left it. I threw my gear into the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors before starting the engine. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in. The engine roared to life, and I didn't waste another second. I backed out of there so fast my tires kicked up dust. I didn't stop driving for miles. Not until I was far away from those woods, from whatever had been out there. I don't know who was watching me that night or why, but I know they were there. I know I wasn't alone, and I know I won't ever go camping alone again. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. Just me, the woods, and a break from all the noise back home. The plan was simple. Drive up to a remote area, hike a few miles in, set up camp, and just relax for a few days. I wanted to disconnect from everything, to just sit by a fire and hear nothing but the wind in the trees. I picked a spot far from the usual campsites, somewhere deep where I wouldn't run into other people. The drive out was long, the roads twisting through miles of dense forest. The last stretch was nothing more than a dirt path, my truck kicking up dust as I made my way to the trailhead. I double-checked my gear before setting off. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, knife, first aid kit. Everything was in order. The air smelled fresh, clean, like damp earth and pine. The sun was warm on my back as I started the hike in. The first few miles were peaceful. The trail was barely used, just a faint path through thick trees. I moved steadily, taking my time, listening to the distant sound of a stream somewhere off to my right. Felt good to be out here, away from everything. By late afternoon, I found a good spot to set up camp, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. The ground was soft with fallen needles, and there was just enough space for my tent and a small fire pit. I dropped my pack, stretched out my back, and got to work. I set up the tent first, making sure it was secure. Then I gathered firewood, stacking it neatly beside a ring of stones. I had brought a hatchet and made quick work of breaking down some larger branches. As the sun started dipping behind the trees, I lit the fire, watching as the flames caught and grew. The warmth felt good against the evening chill. I sat there for a while, eating a simple meal of jerky and trail mix, sipping water from my canteen. The fire crackled softly, the woods settling into a quiet rhythm. The sounds of birds faded, replaced by the distant hoot of an owl. Everything was as it should be, peaceful. But as the darkness deepened, something felt off. It was subtle at first, just a nagging sensation at the edge of my thoughts. I told myself it was just the isolation, my mind adjusting to being truly alone. But then I noticed it, the silence. Not just quiet, silence. No insects, no rustling in the underbrush, just the faint pop of the fire and my own breathing. I listened harder, straining to hear anything beyond the camp. The wind had died down, and the stillness pressed in around me. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. I forced myself to relax, poking at the fire with a stick, watching the embers glow red and orange. Then, somewhere in the trees, something moved. It wasn't a deer. I know the sound of a deer moving through the brush. This was slower, more deliberate, heavy. I froze, gripping the handle of my knife. My heart pounded in my ears. I stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, but saw nothing, just trees and shadows. I waited, every muscle tense, but whatever it was didn't make another sound. After a few minutes, I forced myself to breathe. It was probably just a branch falling or a raccoon nosing through the leaves. I was overreacting. Still, I kept my knife close as I banked the fire and crawled into my tent. The fabric felt thin, too thin, but I told myself I was being stupid. I zipped the door shut, lay down, and waited for sleep to come. I woke up to the sound of something breathing. It was close, just outside the tent. Slow, heavy breaths. I stayed perfectly still, my mind racing. The fire had burned down to embers, casting only a faint glow. I reached slowly for my knife, every movement careful. The breathing continued, steady and deep. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Minutes passed. I lay there, barely daring to breathe myself. I strained my ears, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, just silence again. I stayed awake for hours, gripping my knife, listening to the empty night. Eventually, exhaustion won. I drifted off into a restless sleep. By morning, everything seemed normal again. The fire was cold, but nothing looked disturbed. No tracks, no signs of anything. I told myself I had dreamed it, that my mind had played tricks on me. I made breakfast, packed my gear, and decided to hike a bit further, just to explore. I didn't want to let paranoia ruin my trip. A few miles in, I found something strange. A tree, deep in the woods, stripped of its bark. Not scratched like from a bear, but peeled away in long, clean strips. Nearby, another tree the same way. And another. My stomach twisted. It didn't make sense. I turned back toward camp, moving faster now. I told myself I was just being weird, but my gut screamed at me to leave. I started packing up as soon as I got back, stuffing everything into my pack with shaking hands. The whole time I felt watched. That same thick silence had returned, pressing in on me. As I hoisted my pack, ready to go, I saw it. A footprint. Not mine. Not a boot. Bare. Human. Large. Right at the edge of my camp. My stomach dropped. I didn't think. I just moved. I grabbed my gear and started walking. Fast. I didn't care if I left anything behind. I just needed to get out. I didn't run. I didn't want to make noise, but I kept my pace quick, my head on a swivel. Every step felt too loud. Every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. I made it back to my truck in record time. I threw my gear into the back, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands shook as I started the engine. The moment the tires hit the main road, I felt like I could breathe again. I don't know what was out there. Maybe just some guy living off the grid. Maybe something else. I don't know, and I don't want to know. I just know I'll never go back. I never liked the idea of camping alone, but I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I wanted the quiet, the break from everything, no phone, no people, no responsibilities. Just me and the woods. I picked a spot deep in the national forest, well off the trails, where I wouldn't run into anyone. Took me half the day to hike in, but the place was perfect. A small clearing near a slow-moving creek, surrounded by thick trees. It was late afternoon when I set up my tent and started a small fire. The woods were quiet, too quiet. At first, I welcomed it. No distant car noises, no hum of electricity, just nature. But the more I listened, the more I noticed something was off. No birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the occasional creak of trees swaying in the wind. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just too used to the background noise of life, and the absence of it felt unnatural. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the air turned sharp and cold. I pulled my jacket tight and poked at the fire. The flames cast long, flickering shadows around the clearing. That was when I heard it. A snap, a branch breaking somewhere behind me. My head jerked up. Probably an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe. But then there was another snap. Closer. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing. Just trees and blackness. I told myself I was being stupid, paranoid. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it around the trees. Nothing moved, but I felt it. That strange, unmistakable sensation of being watched. I tried to shake it off, but my body knew before my brain did. Something was out there. Something was watching me. I forced myself to relax, to sit back down and eat. I had a long hike in, I was tired. My nerves were just shot from being alone. I kept telling myself that, but my ears stayed sharp, listening, waiting. As the fire crackled, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. I froze. Not an animal. Too steady, too controlled. Human. I grabbed my flashlight again and shined it into the trees. "Hello!" I called out before I could stop myself. Stupid. So stupid. My voice sounded too loud in the silent woods. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. I sat there for what felt like an hour, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Finally, I convinced myself that I was imagining things, that maybe I had been alone too long and my mind was messing with me. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and kept my knife within arm's reach. I barely slept. Every sound made my heart pound. The wind, the leaves shifting, my own breathing. Every few minutes, I swore I heard something outside. Soft footsteps, the lightest crunch of leaves. My fingers gripped my knife so tightly my knuckles ached. But nothing happened. Morning came slow. When I finally unzipped my tent, my stomach sank. Footprints. Human footprints in the dirt, circling my campsite. They weren't mine. They were fresh. I felt sick. Someone had been out there last night, walking around my tent while I slept, or pretended to sleep, watching me, maybe waiting for me to come out. My mind raced. Did they leave? Were they still out there? I packed up fast, stuffing my gear into my bag, keeping my knife in my hand the entire time. I started back down the trail I had come up the day before. I moved quickly, but not too quickly. I didn't want to look like I was running. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I knew. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened. The forest was still too quiet, too empty. The only sound was my own breath and the distant gurgle of the creek. I was about an hour into my hike when I saw them. The footprints, not mine, ahead of me, on the trail, leading the same way I was going. I stopped cold. Someone was in front of me, moving in the same direction. I felt trapped. I couldn't turn back. That would mean spending another night out here. But if I kept going, I might run right into them. My hands were shaking. I forced myself to breathe, think. I veered off the trail. It was risky, but I had no choice. I moved quietly, keeping parallel to the path but hidden in the trees. I walked for what felt like hours, my heart pounding, my mouth dry. Every twig snap under my feet made me flinch. Then I saw it. A figure, a man, standing in the middle of the trail, facing away from me. Still, just standing there, not walking, not moving, waiting. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just watched. He was wearing dark clothes. His posture was relaxed, too relaxed, like he knew I was coming, like he was waiting for me to reach him. My chest tightened. I took a slow step back, making sure my foot didn't make a sound. Then another. I moved deeper into the woods, circling around. I kept my pace steady, never letting myself rush, never making a sound. I had no idea if he had seen me, but I wasn't taking chances. I kept going, changing direction every now and then, trying to throw off any chance he had of following me. Hours passed. My legs ached. My throat was dry, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. I kept pushing forward until finally I saw it, the road, my car. I didn't run. Not yet. I stayed in the trees, watching, waiting, making sure no one else was around. Then I made my move. I sprinted the last stretch, yanked open the car door, and locked it behind me. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life. As I pulled onto the road, I finally let myself breathe. I looked in the rearview mirror. Just trees. No man. No footprints. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I heard. And I knew, without a doubt, that if I had stayed another night, I wouldn't have been alone. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth as I stepped out of my truck and stretched my arms. The drive had been long, but the solitude of the forest was worth it. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. No distractions, no people, just me, the wilderness, and the quiet peace of nature. I grabbed my backpack and double-checked my supplies. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a first aid kit, and my knife. I always carried a knife. Not that I expected any trouble, but it gave me a sense of security. I locked my truck and took my first steps into the dense woods, following a narrow trail that I had mapped out earlier. The trees loomed tall, their thick branches creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. It felt good to be away from everything. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves, the distant call of a bird, and the rhythmic crunch of my boots against the dirt path. After about an hour of hiking, I found the perfect spot, a small clearing beside a slow-moving stream. The water looked clean, reflecting the greens and browns of the forest like a mirror. I set down my pack and got to work setting up my tent, making sure it was on level ground and away from any dead branches that could fall in the night. Once the tent was up, I collected some dry wood and built a small fire. The flames flickered warmly as I sat on a nearby log, eating a simple meal of jerky and nuts. The quiet was comforting, wrapping around me like a thick blanket. The only movement was the occasional ripple in the stream and the swaying of branches in the light breeze. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature began to drop, and the forest transformed into something darker, more mysterious. That was when I first noticed it, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't a noise or a shadow, just an odd sensation creeping up my spine. I scanned the trees, seeing nothing but the endless stretch of trunks and branches. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But the feeling lingered. I kept the fire going for a while, letting the warmth push back the encroaching cold. The stars began to emerge, dotting the sky in countless numbers. I had always loved the stars, how they made everything else seem small and insignificant. Eventually, my body reminded me of the long hike, and I decided to turn in for the night. Inside the tent, wrapped in my sleeping bag, I closed my eyes, listening to the steady sounds of the forest. Insects hummed, leaves rustled, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. It was peaceful. At least it should have been. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. I stayed still, listening. The usual sounds of the forest were still there, but something felt off. Then I heard it, a soft crunch. Footsteps. My body tensed. Could be an animal, a deer maybe, but the steps were too deliberate, too steady. I slowly reached for my knife, gripping the handle tight as I listened. The footsteps stopped, and for a long moment, there was nothing but silence. I held my breath, waiting. Then, just as I began to think I imagined it, the sound started again, closer this time. I sat up as quietly as I could, straining to hear. My heart pounded in my chest. The fire outside had burned down to embers, leaving only faint light to cast weak shadows through the thin fabric of my tent. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. That same sensation of being watched, stronger now, almost suffocating. Then something brushed against the side of my tent. It was light, almost like a hand grazing the fabric. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I gripped my knife tighter, my mind racing. I needed to see what it was, but I also didn't want to move. Another brush against the tent. My breath came out in shaky puffs, visible in the cold air. Summoning all my courage, I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The dim glow of the embers cast faint light around the clearing, but nothing was there. No movement, no sound. Just the trees standing motionless, their shadows stretching long and twisted. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, watching, waiting, but nothing happened. Eventually, the exhaustion caught up with me, and though every nerve in my body screamed to stay alert, I must have drifted off. Morning came, and with it, a strange, unsettling sight. Around my tent, the ground was disturbed. Footprints, but not boot prints, bare feet. The prints circled my campsite, some coming right up to the entrance of my tent before turning away. I stared at them, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. They were fresh, crisp in the dirt. Someone had been out here, walking barefoot in the middle of the night. I quickly packed up my gear, my hands trembling as I stuffed everything into my backpack. My appetite was gone, replaced by a gnawing unease. I had camped alone before, but I had never experienced anything like this. I needed to get out of there. The hike back felt longer, every sound making me whip my head around. The trees, once a source of peace, now felt like they were closing in on me. I didn't stop to rest, didn't stop to drink. I just kept moving. When I finally reached my truck, I tossed my pack in the back and locked the doors the second I got inside. My breathing was ragged, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I started the engine, the sound breaking the heavy silence, and peeled out of there as fast as the dirt road would allow. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on a main road, surrounded by other cars, other people. Only then did I let out the breath I had been holding. I never went back to that spot, never even thought about it until now. And to this day, I still don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't even know why I thought camping alone would be a good idea. Maybe it was the boredom of life back home or the need to prove something to myself. I wanted the challenge. I wanted to disconnect. So, I picked a spot deep in the national forest, away from campsites, away from people. It was supposed to be peaceful, but it wasn't. I drove for hours before I found the right place. A clearing just off a dirt road, surrounded by dense trees, thick with pine and underbrush. It was remote, quiet, just the way I wanted. The sun was starting to drop behind the trees as I set up my tent and built a fire. I remember how still everything was. No wind, no distant sounds of civilization, just the occasional crack of a branch shifting under its own weight and the soft rustling of something in the underbrush. Small animals, probably. Nothing that concerned me. By the time the fire was going strong, the night had fully settled in. I cooked a can of beans, sat on the log I'd pulled up, and just listened. The fire crackled. Crickets chirped. Something moved out in the trees, just beyond the firelight. A deer, I assumed. I didn't think much of it. Not until I heard something else. Something different. A sharp, deliberate snap, like a branch breaking underfoot. Not small, not the kind of sound an animal makes when it's creeping through the woods. This was firm, deliberate, heavy, like a person. I told myself it was nothing. I tried to ignore the way my skin prickled, the way my breath hitched. I wasn't about to let my imagination get the best of me. So, I stirred the fire, sat back down, and tried to relax. But then it happened again. Snap. Closer this time. My stomach tightened. My hands felt cold despite the heat of the fire. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it over the trees. Nothing. Just endless blackness. Shadows shifting with the sway of branches. I listened hard, but whatever had made the noise had gone silent. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a fox. They could be heavier than you'd think, especially when they moved fast. I had my knife with me, my hatchet. If anything got too close, I was prepared, or so I thought. The rest of the night was quiet. I convinced myself I'd been overreacting, let my guard down just enough to get some sleep. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay there, staring at the nylon above me, listening to the silence outside. Eventually, exhaustion won. I drifted off. Something woke me up. Not a noise, not movement, just something, a feeling, like I wasn't alone anymore. I lay there, heart pounding, barely breathing, straining to hear anything beyond the thin walls of my tent. The fire had died down to embers, barely enough light to see the inside of the tent, let alone anything outside of it. But I could feel it, that presence, that horrible, gut-wrenching sense that something was there, just beyond the thin layer of fabric separating me from the outside world. And then the zipper moved, not fast, not aggressive, just a slow, deliberate tug, a testing motion, like someone was seeing if it would open quietly. I stopped breathing, my entire body locked up. I wanted to move, to grab my knife, but I couldn't. I just lay there, frozen, waiting, hoping I was imagining it. The zipper didn't go any further. It stopped, held there for a moment, then released. I heard a soft shuffle, something shifting outside, then silence. I didn't move for what felt like hours. I just lay there, every muscle locked, every breath shallow. My brain screamed at me to run, to do something, but my body refused. Eventually, somehow, I convinced myself it was nothing, that maybe the wind had caught it, that maybe I was just scaring myself. I had no proof anyone was out there, and I sure as hell wasn't about to go looking. I don't know when I fell asleep again, but when I woke up, The sun was just starting to rise. The embers of the fire were cold. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I unzipped the tent, stepped outside, and froze. There, in the dirt, right outside the entrance of my tent, were footprints. Human footprints. They led from the trees, circled my campsite once, and then stopped right at my tent's entrance. Whoever it was had stood there for God knows how long, just standing, watching, and then they had walked away, back into the woods. No sign of where they had gone, no sign of who they were. I packed my things as fast as I could, threw everything into my truck, and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop, not until I hit the highway, not until I saw other cars, other people. I didn't breathe properly until I was miles away. I don't know who it was. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone out there. I should have known better than to go camping alone. It wasn't my first time, and I liked the solitude, the quiet of the woods, the absence of city noise. I always found a kind of peace in being out there by myself. Just me, the trees, the sounds of nature. I had done it a dozen times before, but this time felt different, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way the wind moved through the trees, or the strange stillness that settled in as the sun started to set. I had picked a spot deep in the forest, far from any roads or marked trails. I liked it that way. No other campers, no distractions. Just the fire, my tent, and whatever was out there in the dark. I set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. It was late afternoon by the time I finished setting everything up. The tent was secure, the firewood stacked, my little camp stove ready for later. As the sun dipped lower, I took a walk to stretch my legs, following a narrow deer trail that wound deeper into the woods. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and every now and then, I heard the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. I didn't go too far, just enough to get a feel for my surroundings before heading back. By the time I returned, the light had faded, and the fire was the only source of warmth against the chill creeping in. I cooked a simple meal, ate in silence, listening to the forest. Normally, there were sounds, crickets, frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl. But as I sat there, poking at the fire with a stick, I realized how quiet it had become. Too quiet. I brushed it off at first. Sometimes, the woods went silent when a predator was nearby. Maybe a fox, maybe a coyote. Nothing I hadn't dealt with before, but something about it felt wrong. The air was heavy, like it was waiting for something. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting my own thoughts get to me. I finished eating, put out the fire until it was just embers, and crawled into my tent. The nylon fabric felt thin, flimsy, like it wouldn't be much of a barrier between me and whatever was out there. I zipped up the entrance, flicked off my headlamp, and lay there in the dark, listening. The silence was thick, pressing in from all sides. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a crunch, faint but distinct, footsteps on dry leaves. My stomach tightened. I held my breath, listening. Another crunch, closer this time. I reached for the knife I always kept next to my sleeping bag, my fingers tightening around the handle. Could be an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, but something about the sound was deliberate, careful, human. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay still, to listen. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. The fabric shifted slightly, as if someone was just inches away, touching it. I felt frozen, every muscle in my body locked in place. Then silence. Minutes passed, but I didn't move. I lay there, gripping my knife, straining to hear anything beyond the blood rushing in my ears. Eventually, the tension in my body eased just enough for me to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal had brushed against the tent. Maybe the wind had moved the fabric. But I knew better. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing just outside, waiting. The hours stretched on, and I stayed like that, barely breathing, until the first hint of dawn crept through the trees. I unzipped the tent cautiously, peering out. The campsite looked exactly as I had left it. No signs of anything disturbed, no footprints. But as I stepped outside, stretching my stiff limbs, I noticed something that sent a cold wave through me. The ashes of my fire had been disturbed. Not by wind, not by an animal. The pattern was too deliberate, as if someone had reached down and dragged their fingers through it. I packed up my gear faster than I ever had before. I didn't eat, didn't stop to rest. I just needed to get out. I walked fast, my back tense, every rustle in the trees making my heart pound. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, watching me, but there was nothing. I made it back to my car in record time, throwing my gear into the back without bothering to organize it. The moment I locked the doors and turned the key in the ignition, I felt like I could finally breathe again. As I pulled onto the road, I told myself it had just been my imagination, that the silence, the footsteps, the disturbed fire, it was all in my head. But I knew the truth. Someone had been out there with me, and they had been watching. The sun was setting behind the tree line when I finally finished setting up my tent. The air had that crisp autumn bite, the kind that felt refreshing but also hinted at how cold the night would get. I was alone, deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. That was the whole point. I needed the solitude. Work had been eating away at me, and I needed a break from everything. Just me, nature, and silence. I picked this spot because it was isolated. No marked trails, no campsites, just pure wilderness. I had hiked in nearly 10 miles, following an old logging road before veering off into the trees. The area was perfect, a flat clearing near a slow-moving creek. The water was clear, cold, and drinkable after boiling. After setting up my tent, I gathered enough firewood to last the night. I built a small fire, just enough for warmth and light, and cooked a simple meal. The silence was comforting at first. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the trees. The night crept in faster than I expected. The darkness out here was different from the city. Thicker, heavier, pressing in from all sides. I sat by the fire for a while, letting my thoughts wander. Then I heard it, a sound, faint but distinct. Footsteps, not the random noise of a squirrel darting through leaves. Slow, deliberate steps. My body tensed. I turned my head slightly, listening. The fire popped, and for a moment I thought I had imagined it. But then it came again, closer. My first thought was an animal, a deer maybe, but deer moved differently. These steps were steady, human. I told myself it had to be a hunter or another camper who had wandered too far. But what were the chances of someone else being out here, this deep in the woods at this hour? I hadn't seen a single soul all day. I reached for my flashlight, my heart hammering as I flicked it on and aimed it toward the trees. Nothing, just the tangled mess of branches and shadows. The steps had stopped the moment I turned on the light. I scanned the tree line, my breath held tight in my chest. The silence was worse than the sound. My skin prickled with unease. After a few minutes, I forced myself to relax. Maybe I was being paranoid. The isolation was playing tricks on me. I turned off the flashlight, letting my eyes adjust again to the darkness. The fire was low, just glowing embers now. I decided to get some rest. I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. I kept my knife close, just in case. The fabric of the tent felt thin, too thin. Every little noise outside made my nerves jolt. I lay there, listening. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees. Normal sounds, nothing unusual. My breathing slowed. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it again. Closer this time. Footsteps, right outside my tent. My blood turned to ice. I didn't move. My hand tightened around the handle of my knife. The footsteps stopped, right next to my tent. My mind raced. Who the hell was out here? What did they want? I didn't dare make a sound. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast. The person, or whatever it was, just stood there. The fabric of my tent barely moved, but I felt their presence. A long, awful silence stretched between us. Then, After what felt like hours, the footsteps moved away. Slow at first, then fading into the distance. I waited, barely breathing, listening for any sign that they would come back. I wanted to check outside, but every instinct told me to stay put. I had no idea who or what I was dealing with. I barely slept. Every little noise set me on edge. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I unzipped my tent and stepped out. The forest looked different in the daylight, less threatening. But then I saw them. Footprints. Clear, unmistakable footprints circling my tent. My stomach dropped. The prints were fresh, barefoot. Whoever had been outside my tent wasn't wearing shoes. I didn't stick around. I packed up my gear faster than I ever had before, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The thought of hiking 10 miles back through the woods with something out there watching me made my skin crawl. The entire way back, I felt it, the weight of unseen eyes on my back. I didn't run, but I moved fast, pushing myself through exhaustion and fear. Every rustle of leaves, every shift in the wind, set my nerves on edge. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors the second I got inside. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The moment the engine roared to life, I felt a wave of relief. I sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I was back on the highway. I never went back to that part of the woods again. To this day, I have no idea who or what was out there with me. But I know one thing, whoever it was, they weren't lost. They weren't some random hiker. They had been watching me, waiting, and for some reason, they had decided to let me leave. I never should have gone camping alone. That thought kept running through my head as I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the thin fabric of my tent. The wind was picking up, shaking the trees around me, and I could hear something moving outside. Something too heavy to be a raccoon, too quiet to be a bear. I had picked this spot because it was remote. That was the whole point of this trip, to get away from everything. No people, no noise, no distractions. Just me, the woods, and my own thoughts. I had driven 5 hours out from the city, parked my car at a small dirt pull-off, and hiked about 6 miles into the forest. I had picked a clearing near a small stream, set up my tent, and gathered firewood before the sun went down. It had been peaceful at first. Then night fell. The first thing I noticed was the silence. I had always heard that forests were noisy at night. Insects buzzing, owls calling, branches creaking. But as the sun dipped below the trees, everything went still. No wind, no rustling, just dead silence. It made me uneasy, but I told myself it was fine. Maybe it was normal. Maybe I just wasn't used to it. Then I heard the footsteps. They weren't loud, just soft crunches in the underbrush. Slow, careful. I turned off my flashlight and held my breath, listening. My tent was in the middle of the clearing, meaning whatever was out there had to be in the tree line, just beyond my fire's dying glow. I waited, but after a minute or two, the sound stopped. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, something harmless, but my gut told me something different. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little noise had me wide awake, gripping the small camping knife I had brought with me. Nothing happened, though. Nothing touched my tent. Nothing approached. By the time the sun came up, I felt stupid for getting so worked up. I spent the next day hiking, trying to shake off the nerves from the night before. The forest was beautiful in the daylight. Tall pines, clear blue sky, fresh air. I felt better as I moved, even found myself enjoying the quiet. By the time I got back to camp in the afternoon, I was exhausted but relaxed. I made a small fire, cooked a quick meal, and sat watching the sun go down. Then, just like the night before, the silence settled in. And then the footsteps returned. This time, they were closer. I killed my fire immediately, plunging myself into darkness. My heart pounded as I listened. Slow, deliberate steps moved just beyond the clearing. I gripped my knife, waiting. The steps circled, moved from one side of the clearing to the other. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it, closer than last night. I forced myself to stay still, barely breathing. Then nothing, just silence. I didn't sleep at all. The first light, I made a decision. I was leaving. I packed my gear quickly, stuffing my tent and supplies into my pack. My entire body was tense, every hair on my skin standing up as I kept looking around. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints circling my camp. I wasn't alone out there. I didn't waste time after that. I slung my pack over my shoulders and started moving, retracing my steps back toward my car. The trail was rough, overgrown in places, but I pushed through as fast as I could. Then I heard something behind me. Not footsteps, breathing. I didn't turn around. I just kept moving, faster. My legs ached, but I didn't stop. I could hear twigs snapping behind me, something moving through the brush, keeping pace with me. I didn't know if it was one person or more, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. The closer I got to my car, the more panicked I became. I stumbled onto the dirt road, gasping for breath. My car was just ahead. My keys were in my pocket. And then I smelled it, rot, like something had been dead for days. The stench hit me like a wall, and for the first time I turned around. There was nothing there. No person, no footprints, no movement in the trees. Just that horrible, lingering smell. I didn't wait. I sprinted to my car, unlocked it with shaking hands, and threw myself inside, locking the doors behind me. My chest heaved as I looked up at the trail. Still nothing. I started the engine and tore out of there, gravel kicking up behind me as I sped down the road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the highway, the sun high in the sky. I never went back, never even looked up the area again. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the footsteps, about the breathing, about the smell. I wasn't alone out there, and I don't think they wanted me to leave. I never liked camping alone, but that weekend, I didn't have a choice. My usual camping buddy, Mark, had to bail at the last minute, and I'd already taken time off work. The forecast looked good, the gear was packed, and I convinced myself it'd be peaceful, maybe even good for me. The place I picked was a few hours north of the city, deep in the woods, a remote spot, far from the usual campgrounds, somewhere quiet. I found it on an old hiking forum, a small clearing by a lake, barely marked on any maps. People said it was untouched, that barely anyone went there. It sounded perfect. The drive out was long. The last stretch was a dirt road, rough and narrow, barely enough for my truck to squeeze through. Branches scraped against the sides, and every few minutes, I had to slow down for deep potholes filled with water from last week's rain. By the time I finally pulled into a makeshift parking area, a patch of flattened grass and dirt, it was already late afternoon. The trail wasn't well marked. It was more of a game path, weaving between thick trees and disappearing into the undergrowth. I hiked in with everything I needed on my back. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No distant sounds of cars, no planes overhead, just the wind pushing through the trees and the occasional snap of a twig under my boots. It took about an hour to reach the clearing. Just like the forum described, it was perfect. A flat space right near the water, with a few big rocks around the edges that would work as seats. The lake was calm, glassy, reflecting the trees that stood tall around it. It looked untouched, like something out of an old survival documentary. I set up my tent close to the tree line, far enough from the water to avoid condensation but close enough for a good view. The sun dipped lower as I gathered firewood, breaking off dry branches and piling them up near a ring of stones someone else had left behind. I built a fire, ate a simple meal, and let the quiet sink in. As night fell, the temperature dropped fast. The fire crackled, throwing shadows against the trees. The only sounds were the occasional splash from the lake, probably fish, and the distant hoot of an owl. I sat there for a while, staring into the flames, feeling small under the vast, star-filled sky. Then I heard it, a rustling, not the wind, something moving through the underbrush, slow and deliberate. Not a squirrel or a rabbit, too heavy for that. My body tensed. I listened, barely breathing. The sound stopped. I told myself it was nothing. A deer maybe, The woods were full of them, but I kept glancing toward the tree line, firelight flickering against the trunks, shadows shifting. I stayed up longer than I planned, waiting, listening. When nothing else happened, I finally forced myself to crawl into my tent. I left the fire burning low just in case. The sleeping bag was warm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I woke up sometime in the night, no idea what time it was, but the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Something had woken me. A sound? A movement? I held still, listening. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, careful, close, right outside my tent. Not animal footsteps, not 4 legs, but 2. Human. A cold wave of fear rolled through me. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. My mind raced. Who else would be out here? There were no marked trails, no campsites nearby. I hadn't seen another car parked where I left mine. The steps stopped. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Then, something brushed against the side of my tent. A light drag like fingertips running along the fabric. I nearly lost it. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but I was frozen. If I unzipped the tent, I'd be exposing myself. If I stayed, I'd just be waiting for whatever was out there to make a move. The sound moved toward the front of the tent. The entrance. I grabbed my knife, the only real weapon I had. My fingers clenched around the handle so hard they hurt. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. Silence. I didn't move, didn't dare. I waited like that for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Nothing. Just the wind and the distant sound of the lake. When the first hint of dawn light crept through the fabric of my tent, I finally unzipped the door. Slowly, carefully. Nothing. The clearing was empty. The embers of my fire had cooled into dull gray ash. The trees stood still, untouched. But then I saw them. Footprints. In the dirt right outside my tent. Not mine. Larger. Barefoot. Leading from the woods, stopping at my tent, then disappearing back into the trees. No other tracks. No sign of who or what had been out there. I packed up in record time. Shoved everything into my bag, barely taking the time to fold my tent. The hike back to my truck was the longest hour of my life. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made my skin crawl. I kept checking over my shoulder, convinced I wasn't alone. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors the second I got inside, and started the engine. I didn't look back as I pulled onto the dirt road, tires kicking up dust. I never went back, never told anyone exactly where that spot was, and I never camp alone anymore. Some places aren't meant to be found. The drive out to the forest was longer than I remembered. I had been here before, years ago, but something about the winding roads and dense trees on either side of the highway made it feel unfamiliar this time. Maybe it was because I was alone. I had told myself that I wanted to get away from everything, take some time to breathe, to clear my head. The stress of work, the endless noise of the city, it was all too much. I needed silence. I needed to be somewhere where the only sound was the wind through the trees and the rustling of animals in the brush. By the time I turned off the main road and onto the dirt path leading into the woods, the sun had already begun its slow descent behind the treetops. I didn't mind. I had planned to get to the campsite before dark, but I wasn't worried. I had all my gear packed neatly in the back of my truck. Tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for a few days. I knew these woods weren't heavily traveled, which was exactly why I had chosen them. No distractions, no people, just me and nature. The trail narrowed as I drove deeper, the branches of the trees brushing against the sides of my truck, the occasional rock bouncing off the undercarriage. I knew I was getting close when I saw the small clearing up ahead, the same spot I had camped in before. I pulled in, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. No engines, no voices, just the distant chirp of insects and the occasional creaking of tree limbs swaying in the wind. I stepped out and stretched, taking a deep breath of the cool evening air. It smelled like damp earth and pine, a scent I had missed more than I realized. I wasted no time setting up camp. The tent went up first, followed by a small fire pit I built out of rocks. I gathered wood, breaking sticks over my knee and stacking them neatly beside the pit. The sky was dimming quickly, the last streaks of orange fading into deep blue. I lit the fire, watching as the flames licked hungrily at the dry wood before settling into a steady crackle. After eating a quick meal, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The woods around me were darker now, the trees looming like shadows against the night sky. The occasional snap of a branch somewhere in the distance reminded me that I was not alone out here. I knew there were animals, deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear if I was unlucky, but they had no interest in me. As long as I kept my food sealed up and away from the tent, I would be fine. Hours passed. The fire burned low, and I decided to call it a night. Crawling into my tent, I zipped the flap shut, cocooning myself in my sleeping bag. The air was colder than I had expected, but the fabric of the bag was thick, keeping me warm. I closed my eyes, listening to the night sounds, letting them lull me into sleep. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't a slow, natural wake-up. It was sudden, instant. My heart was pounding, and I didn't know why. I lay still, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening. The fire outside had burned down to embers, leaving only a faint orange glow that barely illuminated the tent walls. Then I heard it, a sound, faint at first, like a soft shuffling through the leaves. My first thought was an animal, probably a deer walking through the brush. But something about the way it moved made me uneasy. It wasn't the slow, cautious steps of a deer, nor was it the quick, skittering sound of a raccoon. It was deliberate, like footsteps. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time. My fingers gripped the sleeping bag tightly. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. I was alone out here. There was no one else for miles. Another step, then another. It was coming from just outside the tent. I reached for the flashlight beside me, my hand shaking slightly as I wrapped my fingers around it. I clicked it on and aimed it at the tent wall. The light created a faint glow through the fabric, but I couldn't see anything clearly. The footsteps stopped. I waited, my pulse pounding in my ears. Minutes passed. Nothing. Maybe it was just an animal passing through. I let out a slow breath, telling myself to calm down. I turned off the flashlight, rolled over, and forced my eyes shut. It was nothing. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent, stretching my stiff limbs. The fire had gone completely out, leaving only blackened wood and cold ash. The morning air was crisp, the kind that woke you up instantly. I walked around my campsite, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. That's when I saw them. Footprints, human footprints, leading from the trees, stopping just outside my tent. My stomach dropped. The prints were fresh, the damp earth still pressed down in perfect shape. My mind raced. I had heard them. Someone had been here, standing just outside my tent in the middle of the night, watching. I looked around, my eyes scanning the trees. There was no one, just the endless stretch of woods. The prints didn't lead anywhere else, just to my tent. Then they disappeared. It was as if whoever it was had walked up, stood there, and then vanished. A cold chill ran through me. I knew then that I was not alone out here. Someone else was in these woods, and they had come right up to my tent while I slept. My first instinct was to pack up and leave, but then I hesitated. Maybe it was a hiker who had gotten lost. Maybe they saw my fire and came to investigate before deciding to leave. But why not call out? Why not make themselves known? I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The trees around me suddenly felt oppressive, the silence too heavy. I moved quickly, packing up my things, stuffing them into my truck with shaking hands. I didn't care about breakfast. I didn't care about anything except getting out of those woods. As I drove back down the dirt path, the trees closing in around me, I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the endless forest stretching in every direction. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. I pulled over, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I was safe now. The woods were behind me. Whoever or whatever had been out there was gone. I never went back to that forest. I never even looked it up again. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear those footsteps in my head. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone in a cabin, deep in the woods, far from people, far from noise, far from everything. I had rented the place from a guy online who described it as secluded, peaceful, and perfect for getting away from it all. That was exactly what I needed. No phone service, no internet, just nature. The drive there was rough. The last 20 miles were all dirt roads, winding through thick trees. It had rained the night before, and the ground was slick with mud. More than once, my tires slid, and I had to grip the wheel tight to keep control. The deeper I drove, the more isolated it felt. No houses, no cars, not even signs. Just trees and silence. When I finally arrived, I was relieved to see the cabin standing just as it had been in the listing photos. A simple wooden structure, tucked between trees, with a small porch and a stack of firewood against the side. It wasn't big, just one room with a bed, a wood stove, and a small kitchen area. A separate door led to a tiny bathroom. There was no electricity, just a few lanterns. It was exactly what I had wanted. I unloaded my bags, bringing everything inside. I had brought enough food for the week, knowing there wouldn't be any stores nearby. After setting my things down, I stepped outside and took a deep breath. The air was crisp and smelled like pine. The only sounds were birds and the wind through the trees. No cars, no distant hum of civilization, just silence. I spent the first few hours settling in. I collected some firewood, made a small meal, and sat on the porch as the sun started to set. The darkness came fast. Without city lights, it was almost immediate. I lit a lantern and took one last look outside before heading in. The trees were nothing but black shapes now, blending together, forming a wall of darkness around the cabin. Inside, I locked the door, feeling a little foolish for doing so. There was no one out here. I told myself it was just habit. The wind picked up outside, making the trees creak. I climbed into bed, listening to the quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, pressing down on you. I wasn't used to it, but eventually I drifted off. Somewhere in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room was dark, the fire had died down, and everything was silent. Then I heard it, a sound from outside, a soft crunching, like footsteps in the leaves. My heart pounded. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer. I stayed still, listening. More footsteps, slow, deliberate, too heavy for an animal. I sat up, holding my breath. The steps moved closer, stopping just outside the cabin. I stared at the door, waiting. The silence stretched on. Then, after what felt like forever, the steps moved away, fading into the trees. I stayed awake for hours, listening, but the sounds never came back. By morning, I told myself it had just been my imagination. Maybe the wind had knocked something over. Maybe I had still been half asleep. I pushed the thought aside and went about my day. I took a walk through the woods, following a narrow trail behind the cabin. The trees were thick, their branches forming a tunnel overhead. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. The silence was too complete. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just my own footsteps. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. When I got back to the cabin, I felt a wave of relief. I made a fire, ate a small meal, and tried to relax. As the sun set, the uneasy feeling returned. I told myself it was just nerves, the isolation playing tricks on me. That night, the footsteps came again, closer this time, slow, circling the cabin. I sat up in bed, frozen. I thought about calling out, but what would I say? Who would I be talking to? I reached for the lantern, but I stopped myself. If someone was out there, I didn't want them to know I was awake. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, waiting, then a soft tap, just once, then silence. I sat there, heart pounding, waiting for something else. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a light, restless sleep. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I had planned to stay the whole week, but something wasn't right. I stepped outside and froze. The ground around the cabin was covered in footprints. Not animal tracks, shoe prints. Someone had been outside my cabin all night. I grabbed my things and threw them into my car. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The drive back was a blur. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. But there was nothing, just trees. When I reached town, I stopped at a gas station to collect myself. I told the clerk I had been staying in a cabin up in the woods. He raised an eyebrow. "Nobody's rented that place in years," he said. I didn't respond. I just got back in my car and kept driving. I never looked back. The road twisted through the trees, narrowing as I got deeper into the forest. The sun was starting to set, and the last light filtered through the branches, casting long shadows across the dirt road. I hadn't seen another car in miles, which made sense, considering how far off the main highway I had come. The GPS on my phone had lost signal over an hour ago, but I had memorized the turns before setting out. I wasn't worried about getting lost, but there was something unsettling about being this isolated. I was heading to an old cabin that I had rented for a week. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small place by a lake, deep in the woods. The listing had mentioned that it was a bit rundown, but that was fine by me. I wasn't looking for luxury. I needed quiet, a break from everything. No emails, no calls, no city noise. Just the woods, the lake, and time to clear my head. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had dipped below the trees, and the sky was a deep blue. The cabin looked smaller than it had in the pictures. It was a simple wooden structure, with a porch that sagged slightly and a roof that looked like it had seen better days. The front door was closed, but one of the shutters on the window hung loose, knocking softly against the side of the cabin in the light breeze. I stepped out of my car and stretched. The air smelled damp, a mix of pine and earth, with something else underneath, something faintly sour. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and walked up the porch steps. The wood creaked under my weight. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The inside was dark and smelled of dust and old wood. I felt along the wall for a light switch, but when I flipped it, nothing happened. I sighed and pulled out my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a small room with a wooden table, a chair, and a narrow bed pushed up against the far wall. There was a fireplace in one corner, but the hearth was filled with cold ash. The kitchen area was little more than a counter with a few cabinets above it. There was an old gas stove, but I wasn't sure if it worked. I set my bag down and walked over to the window. The glass was grimy, but I could see the lake through it. It was dark now, the surface completely still. I turned back to the room and noticed something strange. The dust on the floor was thick, except for a set of faint footprints leading from the door to the window. They weren't mine. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I had just gotten here. No one else should have been inside. I shook off the feeling and told myself it was probably just from the last person who stayed here. Maybe they had cleaned up before leaving, except for that one spot. I checked the small bathroom. It was basic, just a toilet, a sink, and a tiny shower with a curtain that had yellowed over time. The mirror above the sink was cracked in one corner. I turned the faucet. The pipes groaned before water sputtered out, rusty at first, then clearing. After making sure everything was in working order, I went back to the main room and started a fire in the fireplace. It took a while, but soon enough, the flames crackled, casting flickering light around the cabin. The warmth helped push away the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. I ate a quick meal, then sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the fire. Outside, the forest was silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no night sounds. I lay down, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was just outside, watching. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just the isolation, the unfamiliar place. Eventually, exhaustion won over and I drifted off. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. Something had woken me, but I didn't know what. Then I heard it, a soft creaking, like footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The creaking stopped. I waited, straining my ears, but there was nothing, just silence. I told myself it was probably just the wood shifting from the temperature change. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I found something strange outside. Footprints in the dirt near the porch. They weren't mine. They led from the trees, stopped at the porch steps, then turned back. I checked the cabin door. It was still locked. I tried to tell myself that maybe it had been an animal, but the prints were clearly human. The day passed uneventfully. I stayed close to the cabin, gathering wood for the fireplace and checking out the lake. The water was calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I would turn quickly, expecting to see something behind me, but there was never anything there. That night, I barely slept. The wind had picked up, causing the trees to creak and groan. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to a sound just outside the window, a faint tapping. I held my breath and turned my head slowly. The window was dark, but I thought I saw a shadow move outside. My heart slammed against my ribs. I reached for the flashlight, but my hand was shaking. I clicked it on and pointed it at the window. Nothing. The tapping had stopped. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, staring at the window, waiting. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things, threw them into the car, and got ready to leave. But before I did, I walked around the cabin one last time. Near the back of the cabin, where I hadn't gone before, I found something that made my blood run cold. More footprints. They led from the forest to the window, the same window where I had heard the tapping. But what scared me most was that they weren't just leading to the window. There were marks in the dirt beneath it, as if someone had been standing there for a long time, watching. I didn't waste any more time. I got in my car and drove. As I turned onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was already disappearing behind the trees. I gripped the wheel tighter and focused on the road ahead. I never looked back. I had been looking forward to some time alone, away from the constant noise and rush of daily life. The idea of staying in a cabin deep in the woods seemed perfect. A friend of mine owned it, a small wooden structure nestled miles away from any sign of civilization. He had offered it to me for a week, telling me it was the perfect place to clear my mind and enjoy some quiet. I packed enough supplies to last, loaded my truck, and made the drive out there. The road leading to the cabin was rough, barely more than a dirt path, with thick trees pressing in from both sides. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the sound of my tires crunching over loose gravel was the only noise for miles. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing where it stood. The place was small, built from thick logs with a sloping roof. A porch wrapped around the front, and a single window looked out over the forest. There was no electricity, just an old gas lantern and a wood-burning stove. It was exactly what I had wanted. After unloading my supplies, I locked my truck and went inside. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of aged wood and dust. I set my bags down and checked the place over. There was a narrow bed pushed against the far wall, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with old canned goods. A fireplace sat in the corner, cold and filled with ash. Everything was simple, worn from years of use but sturdy. I spent the first evening settling in, chopping some wood for the stove and cooking a simple meal. The silence outside was almost unnerving. No cars, no distant voices, Nothing but the occasional rustling of leaves and the chirping of crickets. As darkness fell, the forest became an endless black void beyond the windows. I sat by the fire for a long time, staring into the flames, until finally, I turned in for the night. The first strange thing happened sometime in the early hours of the morning. I woke up to a sound just outside the cabin. It was faint, but distinct, the sound of footsteps moving slowly through the dry leaves. I held my breath, listening. The steps stopped, then started again, circling the cabin. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? A deer? Maybe? But the steps were too deliberate, too slow. I lay still for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the noise to stop. Eventually, it did. I listened for a while longer before exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted back to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the memory of the sounds felt almost distant, like a half-remembered dream. Still, when I stepped outside, I checked the ground. The leaves were disturbed in places, as if something had moved through them, but there were no clear tracks. Shaking it off, I went about my day. The second night, I woke up again, this time to something more unsettling. The sound of footsteps returned, but they were closer, almost right up against the walls of the cabin. A slow, dragging noise accompanied them, like something heavy being pulled along the ground. My pulse pounded in my ears as I lay frozen, staring at the ceiling. Then, a soft, deliberate scraping against the wood of the cabin wall. I sat up, gripping the blanket tightly. The noise moved along the length of the cabin, stopping near the door. I waited, barely breathing. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds faded into the woods. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I found fresh disturbances in the dirt around the cabin. Drag marks, faint but visible, leading toward the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. Something about them unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. I spent the day keeping myself busy, trying to shake the unease that clung to me. That evening, I made sure everything was locked. I placed a heavy wooden chair against the door and kept my hunting knife close. Hours passed in silence, the fire casting flickering shadows across the walls. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I clenched the knife tighter. Then, something heavier, a dull thud against the wooden wall. Another, a steady, rhythmic knocking. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. The knocking continued, slow and patient. Then suddenly silence. Minutes passed. Then something new. A faint sound, almost like breathing, just outside the window. My skin crawled. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the floor. I didn't move. I sat there, knife in hand, staring at the window, but I couldn't see beyond the darkness outside. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The woods fell silent again. I barely slept the rest of the night. When dawn came, I stepped outside, scanning the clearing. The ground near the cabin was disturbed again, but this time, something else caught my eye. Near the edge of the trees, half buried in the dirt, was something unnatural. A piece of fabric, torn and dirty, caught on a low branch. I walked toward it slowly, my gut tightening. When I reached it, I hesitated before picking it up. It was old, weathered, but unmistakably a piece of clothing. A shirt, and it wasn't mine. I turned and looked back toward the cabin, suddenly feeling exposed, vulnerable. Someone had been out here. Someone had been watching. I packed my things within the hour, shoving everything into my truck as fast as I could. The feeling of being watched never left me. Even as I drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see something standing at the edge of the trees, watching me go. I never told my friend what happened. I just told him I wouldn't be using the cabin again. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I wasn't alone in those woods, and whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They had been waiting. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone in a remote cabin, away from the noise of the city, away from people, away from everything. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. I needed the break, needed the isolation. Work had been piling up, and I could feel myself burning out. My plan was simple: hike, read, relax, and reset. The drive out there was long, mostly winding roads through dense forest. The kind of roads where you don't see another car for miles. I had rented the cabin online, one of those old wooden places with a stone fireplace and big windows looking out over the trees. The owner had sent me directions and a warning that there was no cell service. That was fine with me. I wanted to disconnect. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting. The cabin was smaller than I expected but looked sturdy. It sat at the end of a narrow dirt path, with trees packed tightly around it. There was a small clearing in front where I parked. I got out, stretched, and breathed in the cold, crisp air. It smelled like pine and damp earth. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves. It was perfect. I unloaded my supplies: food, water, firewood, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries. I had everything I needed. The inside of the cabin was simple but cozy. A main room with a couch and a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom, and a bedroom in the back. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just silence. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, cooked some canned food, and read until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. The bed was old but comfortable enough. I slept deeply. The next morning, I decided to explore. I took my backpack, filled a bottle with water, and set off into the woods. The trails weren't marked, but I wasn't too worried. I had a good sense of direction and my compass. The forest was beautiful. Tall trees, thick undergrowth, the occasional sound of birds or a snapping branch. I walked for hours, stopping now and then to rest. Around midday, I found a small stream. The water was clear, flowing gently over smooth rocks. I crouched down, splashed some on my face, and sat on a fallen log to eat a granola bar. It was peaceful. Then I saw it. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the damp earth, leading away from the stream. I looked around, suddenly aware of how alone I was. The prints were large, maybe a man's, and they didn't belong to me. I hadn't seen another person since I got here. I followed them for a few steps before stopping myself. It was probably just a hiker, I told myself, but something about them bothered me. They weren't coming from anywhere. They just started near the stream and led off into the trees. I decided to head back to the cabin. The hike back felt different, like the trees were closer, the shadows darker. Every now and then, I thought I heard something behind me. A twig snapping, leaves rustling. But when I turned around, there was nothing. Back at the cabin, I locked the door, something I hadn't done the night before. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I checked the windows, making sure they were shut tight. That night, the noises started. Soft at first, branches creaking, leaves moving in the wind. But then I heard something else. A sound that didn't belong. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching on the gravel outside. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I listened, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped near the cabin, right outside. I waited, staring at the dark ceiling. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it and forced myself to sleep. In the morning, I went outside to check. The ground was damp from the night's cold air. There were footprints, leading around the cabin, stopping by the windows. I didn't go hiking that day. Instead, I stayed close to the cabin, keeping an eye on the tree line. I felt watched. The whole day I felt watched. The sun started to set, and I locked myself inside early. The fire burned low as I sat on the couch, gripping the flashlight, waiting. The footsteps came again that night, closer. This time I heard breathing, a slow, heavy sound outside the window. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Then the doorknob rattled. Once, twice. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight so tight my fingers ached. The door was locked. I knew it was locked, but I had never felt so vulnerable in my life. The rattling stopped. The footsteps moved away, but I didn't sleep. At first light, I made my decision. I was leaving. I packed up, loaded everything into the car, and didn't bother cleaning up. I just wanted to go. The engine roared to life and I pulled out fast, tires kicking up dirt. As I turned onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A man stood in the tree line, just at the edge of the clearing, tall, wearing dark clothes, watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until I was miles away, until I saw other cars, other people. Only then did I pull over, hands shaking, breath coming in gasps. I never went back, never contacted the owner, never told anyone what happened. I don't know who he was, what he wanted, or how long he had been watching me. But I know this: I was not alone in those woods, and I never will be again. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A remote cabin deep in the woods, away from the noise of the city, away from people, just me and the quiet of nature. I packed everything I thought I would need: food, water, extra clothes, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and a hunting knife, just in case. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, and he had told me it was in decent condition but warned me that it was deep in the woods, completely off-grid. No phone signal, no electricity, nothing but the cabin and the wilderness. The drive was long, taking me through winding mountain roads, the trees getting denser the further I went. The last stretch of the journey was a dirt path barely wide enough for my car. It was rough, full of potholes and tree roots that made the ride bumpy. After what felt like forever, I finally saw the cabin. It was small, made of old wood that had turned gray from years of exposure. There was a porch with a single rocking chair and a small window to the side, partially covered with an old curtain. The forest around it was thick, pressing in from all sides. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows between the trees. I got out of the car and stretched, taking a deep breath. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was eerily quiet. No sound of cars, no distant hum of power lines, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds. I grabbed my bag and walked up the porch, testing the wooden planks beneath my feet. They creaked but held firm. The door was unlocked, just as I had been told it would be. I pushed it open, and a musty smell greeted me. The inside was simple: a single room with a wooden bed, a small table, and an old cast-iron stove. There was a fireplace on one wall, filled with ash and bits of burnt wood. Dust floated in the air, catching the light from the open door. I dropped my bag on the bed and checked the place out. The windows were small and dirty, but intact. The walls had scratches, probably from past visitors moving furniture around. There were no signs of mice or insects, which was a relief. I set up a few things, placed my flashlight and knife on the table, put my food in a small cupboard, and laid out my sleeping bag on the bed. As the sun dipped below the trees, the cabin grew darker. I lit a few candles I had brought with me and settled into the chair by the fireplace. The silence was both calming and unnerving. I wasn't used to this kind of quiet. No distant city sounds, no hum of electronics, just the occasional crack of wood shifting or the wind whispering through the trees. At some point, I dozed off. I wasn't sure how long I had been asleep, but I woke up with a start. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Something had woken me, but I didn't know what. I listened, holding my breath. The wind had picked up, making the trees outside groan and sway. Then, I heard it. A faint rustling, different from the wind. It was close, too close. I sat up slowly, my heart beginning to pound. The sound came again, a soft crunching of leaves just outside the cabin. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The candles flickered as the wind slipped through the cracks in the walls. I forced myself to stay still, to listen. Then, a thud. Something against the side of the cabin. Not loud, but enough to make my breath catch. I turned toward the window, but it was too dark to see anything outside. I cursed myself for not bringing a lantern. The flashlight was on the table, but turning it on might give away my position. I decided to wait, gripping the knife tighter. Minutes passed, stretching endlessly. The noises stopped. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing. I forced myself to relax, telling myself it was probably just an animal. A raccoon, maybe. A deer brushing against the cabin. I lay back down, still holding the knife, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside, my muscles stiff from sleeping in fear. The ground was covered in a thin layer of fallen leaves and twigs. I walked around the cabin, searching for any signs of what might have been outside. That's when I saw them, footprints. Human footprints. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows at the door. My stomach clenched. Someone had been out here watching me. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The footprints were fresh. Whoever it was had been here last night, standing outside while I slept. I went back inside and locked the door, as if that would do any good. My mind raced. Should I leave? But my car was parked a short distance away, and I had to hike to it. If someone was out there, they could be waiting. I grabbed my knife again and forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was a lost hiker. Maybe someone just curious about the cabin. I spent the day on edge, checking the windows every few minutes, listening for any sound. When night came, I built a fire in the fireplace and stayed awake as long as I could. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. The rustling, the soft crunch of leaves. This time it was slower, deliberate. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't move, barely even breathed. The noise stopped right outside the door. Then the doorknob turned. It was slow, testing. My blood ran cold. I gripped my knife, ready. The knob turned again, harder this time, but the lock held. A long silence followed. Then, footsteps, slow, circling the cabin, pausing at each window. I didn't move. I sat there, staring at the door, my breath shallow. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The footsteps faded into the forest. I didn't sleep that night. At first light, I grabbed my things, threw them into my bag, and left. I didn't run. I forced myself to walk, listening for any sound. When I reached my car, I checked the trees one last time before getting in and locking the doors. I started the engine and drove away without looking back. I never found out who it was. I never told anyone what happened. But I know one thing for sure, whoever it was, they weren't lost. They weren't just passing by. They knew I was there, and they were waiting. I had rented the cabin for a week. It was far from everything, deep in the forest, accessible only by an old dirt road that wound through the trees for miles. It was the kind of place I had been looking for. No neighbors, no distractions, just quiet and isolation. I had been feeling drained, tired of the noise and the constant pressure of everyday life, and I needed this break. Just a few days of hiking, reading, and being alone in nature. The cabin itself was small but solid. It had a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a wood stove in the main room. The walls were old wood, worn and darkened with age. There was no electricity, just an oil lamp on the table and a flashlight I had brought with me. The water came from a well outside, and there was an outhouse a short walk behind the cabin. It was simple, but I liked it that way. I wasn't looking for luxury. The first day was quiet. I unpacked my food, set up my sleeping bag on the old bed, and took a short walk around the area. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, thick with trees and undergrowth. I found a small stream nearby, its water running clear and cold over smooth rocks. The air smelled clean, the kind of freshness you only find deep in the woods, far from cars and buildings. Felt good, peaceful. That night, I built a small fire in the wood stove, made a simple meal, and sat outside for a while before going to bed. The stars were bright, clearer than I had ever seen them. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the distant call of an owl. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had burned low, filling the cabin with a faint orange glow. I listened, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. The woods outside were silent, too silent. I hadn't noticed it before, but the usual sounds of the night, crickets, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, were gone. Then I heard it, a single sharp crack. like a branch snapping underfoot. I stayed still, barely breathing. My heart was pounding. The sound had come from outside, close to the cabin. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe moving through the undergrowth, but something about it didn't feel right. I waited, listening, but the sound didn't come again. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for any signs of what had made the noise. The ground was covered in leaves, undisturbed except for a few deer tracks near the trees. I told myself I had imagined it, that I had been half asleep and overreacting. The day passed quietly. I hiked a few miles into the woods, following a narrow trail that led up a ridge overlooking the valley. The view was incredible. Rolling hills covered in dense green, untouched and wild. It made me feel small in the best way. That night, I locked the door, made sure the fire was well fed, and tried to sleep. Again, I woke up in the middle of the night, and again, the forest was completely silent. I lay still, waiting, and then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I gripped my flashlight and sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The steps were soft, but they were there, moving, stopping, moving again. Someone was outside. I didn't move. I just listened, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped near the front door. A long silence. Then the doorknob rattled. I nearly stopped breathing. I had locked it. I knew I had. But the sound of metal against metal sent a cold wave of fear through me. Someone was testing it, trying to see if it would open. I held the flashlight tightly, ready to turn it on. But I didn't. Instead, I waited. After a few seconds, the rattling stopped. Then the footsteps moved again, slow, shuffling, fading into the trees. I sat there for a long time before I finally got up. I moved to the window carefully, slowly, and looked out. Nothing, just darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked the area again. This time, I found something. Footprints in the dirt near the door. Bare footprints. The toes dug slightly into the soft earth, uneven, like whoever had made them had been walking unsteadily. My stomach turned as I followed them a few feet into the trees. They disappeared into the undergrowth. I thought about leaving. I should have, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was some lost hiker, confused, looking for shelter. Maybe they didn't mean any harm. That night, I sat up with the oil lamp burning low. I didn't bother getting into bed. I just waited, and just past midnight, the footsteps came again. This time, they didn't stop at the door. They moved around the cabin, slow and patient, circling. I could hear the leaves crunching underfoot. The sound moved past the front window, then to the back, then to the side. I held my breath, gripping the knife I had taken from my pack. Then silence. I didn't move. I stayed like that for hours, listening. The fire crackled. The oil lamp flickered, but outside, nothing. The first light, I packed my things. I didn't care about finishing my trip. I didn't care about leaving food behind. I just needed to go. When I stepped outside, my breath caught in my throat. More footprints, dozens of them, all around the cabin, circling, overlapping. Some were fresh, pressed into the damp earth. Others were older, faded, but still there. I got in my truck and started the engine. The dirt road felt longer than before, twisting through the trees. Every shadow felt like something watching. When I reached the main road, I drove straight to the nearest town. I stopped at a small diner, still shaking. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Just nerves, just paranoia. Then the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, asked where I had come from. I told her about the cabin, about the footsteps, about the footprints. She went quiet for a moment, then just shook her head. "You're lucky," she said. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't want to know. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. I had been searching for a quiet place to stay for a few days, away from the city noise and the constant pressure of work. A friend had told me about a small cabin deep in the woods, far from any roads or towns. It was owned by a retired ranger who rented it out to people looking for solitude. I had no reason to suspect anything unusual about it. It was just supposed to be a peaceful getaway. The drive to the nearest drop-off point took me about 4 hours, and from there, I had to hike through the forest for another 2. The trail was well-worn but empty, just the way I liked it. The trees were thick and tall, blocking out most of the sky. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional chirp of birds hidden in the branches. When I finally reached the cabin, I was exhausted. It was a small structure made of dark, weathered wood, sitting in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. There was a narrow porch with an old wooden chair, a single window at the front, and a door with a rusted handle. It looked like it had been standing there for decades, untouched by time. I pushed the door open, and the hinges let out a long creak. Inside, the air was stale, as if no one had been there for months. A small wood-burning stove sat in one corner, next to a stack of firewood. There was a single bed against the far wall, covered in a thin, dusty blanket. A wooden table stood near the window, with a single chair pushed up against it. Everything was simple, functional, and eerily quiet. I set my backpack down and took a moment to settle in. I checked the cabinets for supplies and found a few canned goods left behind, though I had brought my own food. There was a jug of water on the counter, but I planned to collect fresh water from a nearby stream I had passed on my way up. After making sure the cabin was in order, I stepped outside to gather some firewood before nightfall. The air had grown colder, and the forest around me seemed darker than before. As I bent down to pick up a few fallen branches, I had the strange feeling that I was being watched. I turned quickly, scanning the trees, but there was nothing there, just shadows stretching between the trunks. I shook the feeling off and went back inside. The first night was uneventful. I built a small fire in the stove, warmed up some food, and sat at the table with my flashlight, reading a book I had brought. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, making a soft rustling sound. It was peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. But the second night, things changed. It started with a sound, a faint rustling, barely noticeable over the wind. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. It wasn't the wind moving through the trees. It was something closer, something moving just outside the cabin. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. Then, after a long pause, there was a soft crunch, like a footstep pressing down on dried leaves. I sat up slowly, careful not to make any noise. My heart was beating hard in my chest. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it at the window, but the glass was too dirty to see anything outside. I didn't move for a long time, just sat there in the silence, listening. But whatever it was, it didn't make another sound. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been an animal and lay back down. The next morning, I stepped outside to check around the cabin. The ground was damp from the night's dew, and scattered leaves covered most of the clearing. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then, a few feet from the cabin, I noticed something. Footprints. Human footprints. They were fresh, pressed deep into the soft earth. And they weren't mine. A chill ran down my spine. I looked around quickly, but the forest was still and empty. I followed the prints with my eyes, tracing them back towards the tree line. They stopped just at the edge of the woods, as if someone had been standing there watching the cabin. I told myself it had to be another hiker, maybe someone passing through, but that didn't make sense. The cabin was far off any main trail, and I hadn't seen another person since I started my hike. I spent the rest of the day on edge, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. I almost convinced myself to leave early, but I had planned to stay for 3 more nights, and I didn't want to let paranoia ruin my trip. That night, I locked the door and placed a chair under the handle for good measure. I kept my flashlight and a knife beside me as I lay in bed, listening. Hours passed. The fire in the stove burned down to embers. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees. Then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it again. A footstep, then another, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. A long pause, then the doorknob turned, My heart pounded. I gripped the knife tightly, waiting, every muscle in my body frozen. The doorknob rattled, harder this time. The chair against the door shifted slightly. Then silence. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I didn't move. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and at some point, I must have fallen asleep. By morning, the footprints were there again. More of them this time circling the cabin. Some led back into the woods, disappearing into the trees. I didn't stay to find out who it was. I packed my things as fast as I could and left, hiking back down the trail without stopping. My hands were shaking the entire way. I didn't feel safe until I reached my car and locked the doors behind me. I never reported it. What would I have said? That someone had been watching me? That someone had tried to get inside? There was no proof, no damage, nothing stolen. Just footprints in the dirt. But I know what I heard. And I know that if I had stayed one more night, whoever was out there wouldn't have just stopped at the door. I had been planning this trip for months, ever since I found the listing online. A remote cabin deep in the woods, miles away from any town or city, promising complete solitude and a break from the constant noise of daily life. The pictures showed a well-built structure, sturdy wooden walls, a stone chimney, and a wraparound porch. It seemed perfect. The drive out took longer than I expected. The last stretch of road wasn't even a road at all, just a dirt path winding through dense trees. My car's tires kicked up loose gravel, and at one point, I thought I'd get stuck. I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun already dipping below the horizon. The trees around the cabin were thick, their shadows stretching long and dark across the ground. I grabbed my bags, locked my car, and made my way to the door. The key was in a lockbox on the porch, just as the owner had said. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust. I flicked on the lights. A single bulb in the center of the ceiling hummed to life, casting dim light over the small space. There was a living area with a worn-out couch, a small kitchen with an old gas stove, and a single bedroom with a narrow bed pushed against the wall. I set my bags down and went to check out the back. The forest was close, almost too close. The trees stood like silent walls, enclosing the cabin. The only open space was the narrow clearing where my car sat. That first night, I lay in bed listening to the absolute silence outside. No traffic, no people, no distant hum of civilization. Just the occasional creak of wood as the cabin settled and the faint rustling of wind in the trees. I slept deeply, waking only once when something outside made a faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking underfoot. I told myself it was an animal and went back to sleep. The next morning, I went for a walk. I followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest, moving carefully over roots and loose rocks. The deeper I went, the more I felt an odd sense of unease. The trees were thick here, their branches tangled high above, blocking out most of the sky. The air was still. I turned back, deciding not to go any further. That night, I heard the sound again. A crack outside, then another. Something was moving. I sat up in bed, listening. The sound was close, right outside the cabin. I held my breath, my ears straining. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer. But then I heard something that made my stomach drop. A faint, deliberate scraping sound against the cabin wall. I stayed in bed, barely breathing, waiting for whatever was outside to leave. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. The next morning, I went outside to check. There were no tracks, no signs that anything had been there. I told myself I had imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. The third night was worse. I woke up to a noise directly on the porch. The sound of something shifting, moving. Then the doorknob rattled. My heart pounded in my chest. I sat frozen in bed, waiting. The rattling stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. I got up slowly, moving as quietly as I could. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window. I shone the light outside, sweeping it across the porch. Nothing. But then I saw it. A single boot print in the dirt just beyond the steps. Too big to be an animal, too clear to be old. Someone had been there. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed my bags. I had planned to stay a full week, but I couldn't do it anymore. Something wasn't right. I loaded my things into the car, locking the cabin behind me. As I pulled onto the dirt path, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. Standing just at the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just kept driving until I reached the main road. I never found out who or what had been outside my cabin those nights, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never go back. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset. The sky was washed in deep shades of orange and purple, the last bit of daylight slipping behind the treetops. The road leading up to the cabin was narrow, barely more than a dirt path, winding through thick forest. My truck's tires kicked up small rocks as I pulled into the clearing where the cabin stood, isolated, surrounded on all sides by tall trees that seemed to press in. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the quiet. No birds, no wind rustling through the leaves, just complete, unnatural silence. I stepped out and stretched my legs. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. The cabin was small, old, made of weathered wood, with a sagging porch and a roof that looked like it had seen better days. I grabbed my bag from the truck and walked up the creaking steps, the wood groaning under my weight. The key was under a loose plank, just as the owner had told me. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, the hinges protesting loudly. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single room with a small kitchenette in one corner, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a couch pushed against the far wall. A narrow hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of dust and old wood. I dropped my bag by the couch and started checking the place out. The windows were grimy, the glass warped with age. The furniture was worn, the cushions on the couch sunken. There was an old wood stove near the back wall, a stack of firewood beside it. After unpacking, I went outside to gather more firewood. The sun had disappeared behind the trees, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. The forest felt different in the dark. The trees, tall and dense, loomed over me. The silence was unsettling. Even my own footsteps on the damp ground sounded too loud. I grabbed a few logs and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. That first night, I lit a fire and sat on the couch, staring into the flames. The warmth spread through the room, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I glanced at the window, expecting to see something staring back at me. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, rattling the old window panes. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, just the isolation playing tricks on me. Sleep didn't come easy. The bed was hard, the blankets musty. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. The wind outside, the creaks of the cabin settling. Then something else. A sound just outside. A crunch like footsteps on the gravel. My body tensed. I held my breath, straining to hear. Another crunch, then silence. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon, maybe a deer. I forced myself to relax, eventually drifting into uneasy sleep. Morning came with a dull, gray light filtering through the windows. The fire had burned out, leaving only cold ashes. I got up, stretched, and went outside. The ground was damp, the air thick with the scent of wet leaves. That's when I noticed them. Footprints, leading from the tree-line to the porch. My stomach twisted. They were human and they weren't mine. They stopped right at the door, then turned back the way they had come. I scanned the trees, my pulse hammering. Nothing moved. No signs of anyone. The tracks looked fresh, pressed deep into the damp ground. I had no explanation. I hadn't heard a car, hadn't seen any signs of another person. The nearest town was miles away. Who had been out here in the middle of the night? I tried to push the thought away, but the unease stayed with me as I went about my morning. I boiled water for coffee, ate a quick breakfast, but my appetite was gone. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting someone to step out. That day, I decided to stay close to the cabin. I chopped firewood, checked the generator that powered the few lights in the cabin, but my mind kept drifting back to the footprints. By the time the sun started setting, I was on edge. I double-checked the locks, made sure the windows were shut tight. As darkness fell, I sat by the fire again, listening. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My chest tightened. I grabbed the fire poker, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I sat frozen, every muscle in my body tense. Then, a sound against the door. A soft, dragging sound, like fingers trailing along the wood. My breath came in shallow gasps. I didn't move. I didn't dare. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, I forced myself to peek out the window. The porch was empty. The forest beyond was a wall of darkness. I barely slept that night. Every noise made me jolt awake. By the time morning came, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things quickly, tossing them into the truck. But when I turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. My stomach sank. I popped the hood, but I had no clue what was wrong. The truck had been fine the day before. I weighed my options. The nearest town was too far to walk before nightfall. There was a road, but I hadn't seen another car since I arrived. I decided to wait one more night and leave at first light. I locked myself inside, not lighting the fire, not making a sound. Just after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, moving around the cabin, slow and deliberate. Then, a faint tapping on the window. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed perfectly still, heart pounding so loud I thought it would give me away. The tapping continued, rhythmic, persistent. Then it stopped. Silence stretched on. I didn't sleep at all. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I grabbed my bag and stepped outside. The footprints were there again, circling the cabin. My hands trembled as I started walking, following the road, moving as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. It took hours, but eventually, I reached a small gas station. I used their phone to call for a tow. The mechanic who arrived looked at my truck, then at me. He said there was nothing wrong with the engine. It started on the first try. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain. I just got in and drove, putting as much distance between me and that cabin as I could. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I was not alone in those woods. I don't know why I agreed to spend the weekend alone in that cabin. Maybe it was the way my friend Mike had talked it up, saying it was the perfect place to get away from everything. No service, no people, just the quiet of the woods. Maybe it was because I just needed a break from the city, from work, from life in general. Whatever the reason, I had packed up my truck on Friday afternoon and made the drive out into the mountains, following the long, winding dirt road until I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood. It was smaller than I had imagined, a one-room structure with a lofted bed above a tiny kitchenette. The wood was old, the kind that had darkened with time and weather. There was a front porch with a single wooden chair and a fire pit a few yards away, surrounded by stumps for sitting. The forest pressed in from all sides, thick and unyielding, the trees tall and close together. It was quiet, except for the occasional sound of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. It felt isolated in a way that was both peaceful and unsettling. I unlocked the door with the key Mike had given me and stepped inside. It smelled of aged wood and dust, with the faintest hint of smoke from past fires. There was a small stove, a sink with a hand pump, and a narrow cot against the far wall. A single window looked out into the woods, and a ladder led up to the loft where the main bed was. There was no electricity, just a few oil lamps and a pile of firewood stacked against the wall. After unloading my things, I decided to take a walk before it got dark. The woods were dense but not impossible to navigate, and I found a narrow trail leading away from the cabin. The air was cool, and the deeper I went, the quieter it became. I walked for about half an hour before turning back, noting how easy it would be to lose my way if I weren't careful. By the time I returned, the sun was low, and I decided to start a fire. The flames crackled, sending sparks into the air as I sat on one of the stumps and watched the night settle in. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional chirp of a cricket or the rustle of something moving in the underbrush. I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched, telling myself it was just my imagination. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. I ate a simple meal, then went inside, locking the door behind me. The oil lamp cast flickering shadows on the walls as I climbed the ladder to the loft. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and despite my unease, I eventually drifted off to sleep. I woke up to a noise outside. It was faint but distinct, the sound of footsteps on dried leaves. My heart pounded as I listened, barely breathing. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, moving past the cabin. I told myself it was an animal, but the steps were too heavy, too measured. I reached for my phone before remembering there was no service. My truck was parked out front, but I wasn't about to go outside. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sounds to return. But after a long while, there was only silence. The next morning, I found nothing unusual around the cabin. No tracks, no signs that anyone had been there. Still, the feeling of being watched hadn't left me. I decided to stay close to the cabin for the day, chopping wood and keeping the fire going. The hours passed slowly, and by the time the sun started to set, I felt exhausted but uneasy. That night, the sounds came again. This time, they were closer. A slow shuffling near the porch, then what sounded like something brushing against the wall. I stayed in the loft, barely daring to breathe. The noises continued for what felt like hours before fading into the distance. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. The dirt near the porch had been disturbed, as if someone had been standing there for a long time. There were no clear footprints, but the grass was pressed down in strange patterns. I considered packing up and leaving, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it had been an animal after all. Maybe the isolation was just getting to me. The third night was worse. I was woken by the sound of something tapping against the window. The window was small, barely large enough for a person to fit through, but the thought of someone standing there in the dark made my blood run cold. I stayed frozen, waiting. The tapping stopped, and then, for the first time, I heard breathing. Deep, slow, right outside the glass. I gripped the knife I had brought with me, my hands shaking. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Eventually, the breathing faded. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things, threw them into the truck, and started the engine. The road back felt longer than before, the trees pressing in on all sides. Every now and then, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching me leave. I never told Mike what happened. I just handed him back the key and made an excuse about being too busy to go back. He shrugged it off, probably assuming I just wasn't cut out for the solitude. I didn't correct him, but sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about that cabin, about the sounds in the dark, and I wonder if whoever or whatever was out there that weekend is still waiting for someone else to come along. I wanted to get away from everything. The city, the stress, the endless noise. I needed space to breathe, to clear my head. So, I rented a cabin deep in the woods, far from any town. The pictures showed a small wooden structure, surrounded by thick trees, no neighbors for miles. It was exactly what I was looking for. The drive took most of the day. The last stretch was a dirt road, winding through dense forest, barely wide enough for my car. No signs, no streetlights, just trees pressing in from both sides. My GPS lost signal long before I reached the cabin, but I had printed out directions just in case. When I finally arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin looked old but sturdy, the wood dark from years of exposure to the elements. The small porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up to the door. The key was in a lockbox, just as the owner had said. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It was simple but comfortable. A single main room with a bed in the corner, a couch, a wood stove, and a small kitchen area. The bathroom was a separate little room off to the side. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just a stack of old books and a radio that barely picked up any stations. That was fine. I wasn't here for entertainment. I dropped my bag, took a deep breath, and let the silence settle around me. It was strange at first. No hum of traffic, no voices, just the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. That first night, I built a fire in the stove, made a simple meal, and sat on the porch with a book. The air was crisp, the sky full of stars. Felt good to be away from everything. I don't know what woke me in the middle of the night. The sound, maybe, or just the unnatural silence. I lay there, listening, but all I could hear was the wind outside. The fire had burned low, and the room was cold. I got up to throw another log in. As I stood by the stove, I glanced at the window and froze. Something had moved outside. It was just a shadow, a flicker of movement against the trees. I stared, waiting for it to happen again, but there was nothing. Probably an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easy after that. The next day, I explored the area. A small path led away from the cabin, winding deeper into the woods. I followed it for a while, enjoying the quiet. The trees were thick, the ground covered in fallen leaves. I didn't see any signs of other people, no old campsites or trails, just untouched wilderness. Felt remote, isolated. That evening, as the sun was setting, I heard something, a soft rustling in the trees, then a snap like a branch breaking underfoot. I turned quickly, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. That night, I locked the door. I didn't sleep well. Every little sound made me tense up. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. But when I finally worked up the courage to peek out the window, there was nothing but darkness. The third day, I decided to check the area around the cabin more closely. I found something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints. They weren't mine. I had only worn hiking boots, and these were different. Barefoot. Human. The prints were fresh, leading from the tree line to the cabin, circling around it, then back into the woods. I felt a cold knot of fear settle in my stomach. Someone had been here last night, watching. I packed my things. The plan had been to stay a week, but I wasn't about to spend another night here. The problem was my car wouldn't start. It had been fine when I arrived, but now the engine wouldn't turn over. No signal on my phone, no way to call for help. I was stuck. I spent the rest of the day inside trying to stay calm. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just some local wandering through. But why circle the cabin like that? Why come so close? As night fell, I locked the door and made sure the stove was burning hot. I sat up for hours listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Close. Slow. I held my breath, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Then the handle moved. Someone was trying to get in. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a fire poker, and stood by the door. The handle jiggled again, harder this time. Then silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I sat down, still gripping the poker. The fire burned low. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, the sun was coming up. I opened the door slowly, heart hammering. The footprints were there again, leading away into the woods. This time, there was something else. A knife, stuck into the porch railing. A long, rusted blade, the handle wrapped in old cloth. That was it. I wasn't waiting around to find out who left it. I gathered my things, forced myself to stay calm, and tried the car again. This time, it started. I didn't look back as I drove away. Didn't stop until I was miles away, back on paved roads, back in civilization. I never found out who it was. The owner of the cabin said no one lived nearby, just empty woods for miles. Maybe it was some drifter, some local hermit. Or maybe it was someone who had been watching for a long time, waiting for someone like me to come along. All I know is I won't be going back. I needed a break from everything. The city was starting to wear me down. The noise, the rush, the constant pressure of work. I just wanted to be alone for a while, somewhere quiet, away from all the distractions. That's why I rented a cabin deep in the woods. It wasn't a fancy place, just a small wooden structure with a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom. It was exactly what I needed. I packed light, just the basics, some clothes, canned food, a few bottles of water, a flashlight, and a hunting knife. I wasn't planning on going too far into the woods, but I wanted to be prepared. The cabin was about a 2-hour drive from the city, followed by another hour on a rough dirt road. It was completely isolated. No neighbors, no cell phone service. That was the whole point. When I arrived, it was late afternoon. The air was cool, the trees around the cabin tall and thick. The place looked even more remote than I had imagined. The wood of the cabin was aged and dark, the windows slightly dirty. There was a small porch with a rocking chair and a pile of firewood stacked against the side. The key was under a loose rock by the front door, just like the owner had said. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. The furniture was basic, a small couch, a wooden table, a single bed with a thin mattress. The kitchen had an old stove and a small fridge that ran on a generator. There was no TV, no internet, just a few shelves with some books and a lantern on the table. The silence was thick, the kind that makes you hear your own breathing. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire in the small fireplace, made a simple meal, and read for a while before going to bed. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. Felt peaceful. I slept well, better than I had in months. The second day, I decided to explore the area. I walked through the woods, following a small trail that led away from the cabin. The forest was dense, the trees towering over me. I found a stream about a mile away, the water clear and cold. I sat there for a while just listening. No cars, no voices, nothing but the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was perfect. But on the way back, I noticed something odd. A tree, not too far from the cabin, had deep scratches in its bark. Not the kind left by an animal. These were long, straight, and deliberate, like someone had taken a knife to it. I ran my fingers over the marks. They were fresh. I tried to brush it off. Maybe someone had been out here before me. Maybe it was nothing. I forced myself to ignore it and walked back to the cabin. That night, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing sounds outside, small snaps, like twigs breaking underfoot. Could have been an animal, but it felt off. The noises would start and stop, always just far enough away that I couldn't see anything when I looked outside. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I found footprints. Not mine. They were faint, but they were there, leading from the edge of the woods to the porch and then back again. Someone had been here, watching. I told myself it was just a hiker, someone passing through, but I couldn't shake the unease settling in my gut. I kept the knife close that day, staying near the cabin instead of wandering. I built a fire early, as if the light would somehow keep whatever was out there away. That night, I barely slept. Every small sound made me sit up, gripping the knife in the darkness. Around midnight, I heard something heavier than before. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. They circled the cabin once, then again. I held my breath, listening, my heart hammering in my chest. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside. More footprints, clearer this time. Someone had been standing by the bedroom window, watching. I had planned to stay a week. I packed my bag that morning. As much as I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, I knew it wasn't. I locked the cabin behind me, threw my bag into the car, and started driving. A few miles down the road, I saw something in my rearview mirror. A figure, standing at the tree line, watching my car disappear. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I never went back. I had been hiking alone for the past 4 days, deep in the wilderness, far from any marked trails. I liked being alone out here. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet you don't get anywhere else. Just the sound of wind moving through the trees, birds calling from somewhere up high, and the occasional rustling of some small animal in the underbrush. I had packed enough supplies for a week, carrying everything on my back as I made my way through the thick forest. The first few days had been uneventful. I found good spots to camp each night, cooked simple meals over my small stove, and rested well. But on the fourth day, the weather changed. The sky had been cloudy all day, and by late afternoon, it started to drizzle. I wasn't too worried. My gear was waterproof and I had been in worse conditions before. But as the light faded, the drizzle turned into a steady rain, and I realized I needed to find shelter soon. Setting up camp in the rain was never fun, and I didn't want to wake up in a soaked sleeping bag. That's when I saw it. A cabin, barely visible through the trees, maybe half a mile away. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I had studied the maps before coming out here, and there hadn't been any mention of structures in this area. But there it was, a small, dark cabin with a slanted roof, standing alone in the woods. I hesitated. I wasn't the kind of person who went looking for trouble, and finding an abandoned building in the middle of nowhere was the kind of thing that could either be a lucky break or a very bad idea. But the rain was coming down harder now, and the idea of spending the night in a dry cabin instead of a wet tent was too tempting to pass up. I approached carefully, stepping over fallen branches and slick patches of mud. The cabin looked old but sturdy. The wood was dark with age, and the windows were covered in grime. The front door was slightly open, swaying just a little in the wind. I pushed it open wider, half expecting some animal to dart out, but nothing moved inside. I stepped in, shaking the water off my jacket. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of damp wood and something else I couldn't quite place. It was a single-room cabin, empty except for an old wooden table, a chair, and a small cot pushed up against the far wall. The floor was covered in dirt and leaves, as if the wind had been blowing through the open door for years. I set my pack down and pulled out my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. There were no signs that anyone had been here recently. No footprints in the dust, no fresh wood in the small fireplace. Whoever had built this place had left it behind a long time ago. I decided to stay the night. The rain outside had turned into a downpour, and there was no way I was setting up camp in that mess. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot, feeling the frame creak under my weight. It wasn't comfortable, but it was better than the cold ground. I ate a quick meal from my pack, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. I wasn't afraid, but something about the place made me uneasy. Maybe it was just the way the wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, or the way the trees outside seemed to lean closer in the darkness. I tried to sleep, but it was difficult. Every little noise made me open my eyes. A branch snapping outside, the wind shifting, the creak of the wooden walls settling. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Then I heard something different, a sound that didn't belong. It was soft at first, a faint scraping sound, like something dragging against wood. I held my breath, listening. It stopped for a moment, then started again, this time coming from near the door. I sat up slowly, reaching for my flashlight. I shone the beam toward the door, half expecting to see an animal trying to get in. But there was nothing, just the old wooden door, slightly ajar, moving with the wind. I got up and walked over, pushing it shut. The latch didn't hold well, so I dragged the chair over and wedged it under the handle. That should keep it from blowing open again. I lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept thinking about that sound, the dragging noise. I tried to convince myself it had been the wind, but something about it didn't feel right. An hour passed, maybe more. I was lying there, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it again, louder this time. A scraping, dragging sound. Not from the door, from inside the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding. My flashlight was still in my hand. I flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the room. The chair was still against the door. The table and cot hadn't moved. Then I saw it, the floor, near the far wall, where the dirt and leaves had been scattered. Something had been moved. The dust had been disturbed, as if something had been dragged across it. I stood up slowly, moving toward it. My boots made no sound on the wooden floor. I knelt down, shining my light closer. A trapdoor. It had been hidden beneath the dirt and debris. The edges were barely visible, but now that I was looking for it, I could see it clearly. and it had been moved recently. My stomach tightened. Someone had opened this, and whatever was down there wasn't alone. The idea of spending a few days alone in a cabin deep in the woods seemed perfect when I first planned it. Life had become too noisy, too crowded, and I needed a break from everything. A friend had recommended the place, an old but well-kept cabin about an hour away from the nearest town, completely off-grid. It was owned by an older couple who rented it out occasionally. No cell service, no internet, just trees and silence. Exactly what I was looking for. The drive there was peaceful at first. The road wound through dense forest, sunlight filtering through the trees, casting moving shadows across the dirt path. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. I hadn't seen another car for miles. When I finally reached the cabin, I parked my car near the porch and stepped out, stretching after the long drive. The cabin was simple, just a small wooden structure with a covered porch and a single window facing the clearing. The trees pressed in close around it, making it feel almost hidden. I unlocked the door with the key the owners had left for me under a rock near the entrance and stepped inside. The air smelled of wood and dust, the way old cabins always do. Inside, everything was basic but comfortable. There was a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a fireplace in the main living area. A few shelves lined the walls, holding old books, a lantern, and other small items left by previous guests. A handwritten note from the owners sat on the wooden table, welcoming me and reminding me to use the generator for power if needed. I spent the first couple of hours unpacking and getting used to the place. I checked the small gas stove, made sure the water pump worked, and tested the old generator outside. Everything seemed fine. I had brought enough food to last me the whole trip, and there was a pile of firewood stacked against the side of the cabin. The first night was uneventful. I sat on the porch for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The air was cool, and the only noise was the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind moved through the trees. It was the kind of quiet I had been craving. When I finally went inside, I locked the door behind me, checked the windows, and went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling uneasy. The room was completely dark except for the faint glow of the embers in the fireplace. Something had woken me, but I couldn't tell what. I lay still, listening. Outside, the wind had died down, and the forest was silent. Too silent. No night sounds, no insects, nothing. Just a heavy, pressing quiet. I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to break the silence. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the window. I shook off the strange feeling from the night before and went about my day. I spent most of the morning exploring the area around the cabin. There was a narrow trail leading deeper into the woods, and I followed it for a while, enjoying the fresh air. The forest felt different during the day, calmer, less intimidating. I found a small stream not far from the cabin, its water clear and cold. I sat on a fallen tree, listening to the sound of the water, letting the quiet settle over me. That evening, as the sun set, I gathered some firewood and started a fire outside. I cooked a simple meal, enjoying the warmth of the flames as the air grew colder. The feeling of unease from the previous night had almost faded. Then I heard it, a sound coming from the trees. Soft, almost careful footsteps. I turned my head sharply, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The forest was thick, the trees forming a solid wall of blackness. I couldn't see anything, but I knew I had heard something. A branch snapped, closer this time. I stood up, heart pounding. Probably an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, but something felt off. The sound of the footsteps had been deliberate, too measured. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shined it into the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees. I stayed by the fire for a long time, listening, but the sound didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it and went inside, locking the door behind me. I kept the fire going in the fireplace and sat by the window for a while, staring out into the darkness. Hours passed. Just as I was beginning to feel tired, I heard it again. The footsteps, but this time they were closer, just outside the cabin. I froze. The sound was unmistakable, slow, deliberate steps moving around the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I reached for the flashlight again but hesitated. Whoever or whatever was out there, I didn't want them to know I was awake. The steps stopped near the porch. I strained to hear anything else, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, softly, the doorknob rattled. I gripped the flashlight tightly, barely breathing. The rattling stopped after a few seconds, and the footsteps moved away, fading into the trees. I sat there, heart pounding, until the first light of dawn appeared through the window. When I finally stepped outside, I checked the ground around the cabin. The dirt was damp from the night air, and there, leading from the edge of the forest to my door, were footprints. Bare, human. I packed my things quickly, throwing everything into my bag. I wasn't staying another night. I loaded my gear into the car, got in, and turned the key. The engine sputtered but didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. Panic rose in my chest. I checked the battery, the fuel, everything seemed fine. But the car wouldn't start. I had no choice. I grabbed my backpack, took a deep breath, and started walking. The road was long, but I knew if I followed it, I'd eventually reach town. I kept looking over my shoulder, my nerves on edge with every sound from the forest. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a truck approaching from the distance. I waved it down, relief flooding through me as the driver pulled over. When I got back to town, I called the owners to let them know I was leaving early. I didn't mention what had happened. I just told them my car had broken down, and I had decided to leave on foot. A week later, the owner called me back. He had gone to check on the cabin and found my car still there, untouched. The strange part, he said, was that when he tried the ignition, the car started on the first try. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I'm never going back. The drive to the cabin took longer than expected. The roads were winding, cutting through dense forests, and the occasional pothole made the journey rougher than I had planned. The rental car wasn't in the best shape either, but it was enough to get me there. I had been wanting a break from everything, the noise of the city, the constant notifications on my phone, and the never-ending responsibilities. A few days alone in the mountains seemed like the perfect way to reset. When I finally arrived, the sun was beginning to set. The cabin was exactly as described, small, rustic, and isolated. It was built from thick logs, and the roof looked recently repaired. There was a small porch with a single wooden chair, and a stack of firewood leaned against the side of the cabin. The area around it was mostly trees, towering pines, and a few bare, skeletal branches that creaked softly in the wind. I hadn't seen another person for the last hour of my drive, which only confirmed how truly alone I was out here. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. A small kitchen area, a couch, and a fireplace in the corner. A single bed with heavy blankets was pushed against the wall. There was a small bathroom, just enough for what I needed. It smelled of old wood and something faintly damp, but that was to be expected. The first thing I did was check my phone, no service. That was part of the plan, though, so I wasn't too concerned. I set my bag down, took a deep breath, and told myself that this was exactly what I needed. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple meal, read for a while, and listened to the sounds of the forest outside. It was colder than I had expected, so I built a fire. The crackling of the flames was oddly comforting. I slept well, despite the unfamiliar surroundings. The next day, I decided to explore the area. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, and the ground was uneven, covered in fallen branches and patches of damp leaves. I walked for hours, not really following a path, just enjoying the silence. At one point, I found a small stream, its water clear and ice-cold. I sat by it for a while, listening to the steady flow, feeling the sun on my face. It was peaceful, and I told myself I had made the right choice coming here. It was only on my way back that I started to feel uneasy. The woods, which had felt welcoming before, suddenly seemed different. The trees were too still, the air too quiet. I had the sense that something was watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I quickened my pace anyway. By the time I reached the cabin, my heart was pounding. I locked the door behind me and forced myself to shake off the feeling. That night, I struggled to sleep. Every little noise outside made me sit up and listen. The wind rustled the trees, but every now and then, I swore I heard something else. A soft crunching like footsteps. I reminded myself that animals moved through these woods all the time, but that didn't make it easier to relax. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. It was pitch dark, the fire long since burned out. I lay still, listening. There it was again, that crunching sound. Closer this time. My breath caught in my throat. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. Then something scraped against the side of the cabin. Not the wind, not an animal. Something deliberate. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. I slowly reached for the flashlight beside my bed. My hand was shaking. I didn't want to turn it on. I didn't want to see what was outside, but I couldn't just lay there waiting. I took a deep breath and flicked it on. The light cast long shadows against the walls. I forced myself to get up, step by step, and move toward the window. The glass was cold under my fingers as I lifted the curtain just enough to peek outside. Nothing, just trees, darkness, and the faint outline of the porch. My breath fogged up the glass as I exhaled. Maybe I had imagined it. I turned away, but just as I did, I heard it again. Closer, a low creak of the porch boards under weight. I spun back to the window, but this time I didn't lift the curtain. Couldn't. I stood there, frozen, listening. The sound stopped. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I stayed by the window, flashlight off now, waiting for something more. But nothing happened. Eventually, I forced myself back to bed, though I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I stepped outside hesitantly, half expecting to find footprints or some other sign that I hadn't imagined everything. But the ground was undisturbed. The porch was empty. If something had been there, it hadn't left any trace. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I made up my mind to leave early. Maybe I was overreacting, but I didn't care. I packed up quickly, loaded the car, and took one last look at the cabin before getting in. I locked the door behind me out of habit, though I knew it wouldn't matter if someone or something really wanted to get inside. The drive back felt longer. The trees seemed to press in closer, and I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing, just the road and the endless forest. By the time I reached the main highway, I felt a weight lift off my chest. I told myself I had let my imagination get the best of me, that I had scared myself for no reason. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Something had been out there. Something had been watching. And I was just lucky I left before I found out what it was.